أوصينا بالمدان يا الله.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Amma ba'd, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome all of our viewers, alhamdulillah, to another edition of the Karima live stream. And today we have two very special guests. I'm joined by my brother, Raja Yusuf, who brings immense credentials to today's podcast by having watched every single episode of Ertugul twice, which is basically a PhD in Ottoman history, I think. And then slightly more importantly, we're also joined by one of my teachers, somebody I have a lot of love and respect. I see him as a mentor. Dr. Ustad Yakoob Ahmed is joining us from Istanbul. I will just give a short introduction to Dr. Yaqoob and why he's, I think, very important. I met Dr. Yaqoob. I went a couple of years ago to this sort of like summer intensive for the Islamic social sciences in Istanbul, and I had the honor of studying with Dr. Yaqoob there. I mean, he is a PhD from SOAS University, where he studied the sort of the last moments of the Ottoman Khilafah, the 1909 constitutional crisis specifically, and the role of the ulama. Just if anybody really wants the details of his PhD thesis, I think it was. And one of the things I found remarkable about him was he had this power or this gift that he would give you confidence in your faith as a Muslim. Especially all the Western Muslims there, with everything that's going on, it just gave you an izzah that Islam was an incredible thing, and it has the potential to be, and it still is an incredible thing, but it has a potential to be an incredible, powerful force in the world today even. And that was one of the most incredible things, and we bonded a lot, alhamdulillah, over many things. One of the things me and Dr. Yaqoob both share a deep love for is Liverpool Football Club, and fortunately or unfortunately, seeing as how how things are going, but. And then, you know, one of the things we've also been very honored as part of the Karima Foundation to host Dr. Yaqoob. This is our third time hosting him now. We hosted him once in person, where he did a session on the life of Sultan Abdul Hamid, rahimahullah ta'ala. Then we did a session on live stream on the Hagia Sophia. And then and this is our third session now. And Dr. Yaqoob is somebody I've always found. He's you know, like always ready to give khidmah for the sake of Allah Ta'ala, and whenever I've needed him, he's always been there for me in terms of academic help, in terms of I needed, you know, and we are going to be shortly, inshallah, we've recorded a 4-part series on the history of the Uthmani Sultanate or the Uthmani Khilafah from beginning till end, and that will be released maybe today or tomorrow, inshallah Ta'ala. And this is sort of an introduction to that, and we hope that people will view that as well, inshallah. So, introductions aside, how are you, Dr. Yaqoob? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good. It's good to see you guys again.
Alhamdulillah. And how are you?
Alhamdulillah. Very honored to be here.
Alhamdulillah. I mean,
Are you a Liverpool supporter as well?
As a what, sorry?
Liverpool supporter.
I know they kick a ball on a field. What they do with it, I have no idea. There's a lot of my friends and colleagues attend them for not very good circumstances, but that's about it.
I don't want to bring it up now, but there's a link between the Ottomans and Liverpool, the city, for sure, especially near the end with the life of Sultan Abdul Hamid. But that's not the TV show we've been advertising, so we're not gonna. I know there's a brother with Payataht who's come on, but that's a different TV show. I mean, I think we wanted to start off with, because this is sort of centered around Ertugul, the TV show, which has just been causing massive waves for a few years now in the Muslim world, and sort of the conversation around that. And I think just to start off with, I mean, there's a very fine line between fact and fiction, and between attracting viewers and being honest to the truth. And so I just wanted to start off with, and by the way, viewers, we're welcoming questions, so engage with us as much as you can. Share the link, like, subscribe, all of that jazz, and then obviously send in all your questions, and we'll try and get to them with Dr. Yaqoob while he's here. But just to start off with, I mean, was Ertugrul a real person? And how much do we know about him, and how true is the TV show to the reality of that man?
Okay, Bismillah. So, yeah, of course, I mean, there's no denying he is a real person. I mean, we have enough evidence to suggest that the father of Osman Ghazi existed, and his name was Ertugul Ghazi. We have that amount of information. We have the information that he was in the region at that given time. So there's no denying his existence, although some academics have tried to question whether he was a real person or not. But we have enough evidence to suggest that he was somebody that existed in that sense. But it's his life wasn't documented in the detailed manner that you're seeing in the TV show. And that's understandable. But then the question then remains is, why has the TV show become so popular, right? And I have my theory on that and my opinions on why the TV show has become popular. I don't have a problem with the TV show per se. I understand what the objective was behind the show when it first came out, which was designed for a Turkish audience. This has to be understood. It wasn't designed for an international Muslim audience or an international audience, but the fact that Muslims, whoever I've met, have resonated with it tells us something about not only the show, but about how the Ummah feel in the world that they live in right now. And in that sense, I mean, what I took from the show, more importantly, was then the importance of Islamic history, right? The why Muslims are going to continuously look back in the past to find people who they can resonate with, who they can look up to, who they find as heroes, and who are relatable. So, yeah.
I think the interesting thing is you touched on, Doctor, there was why the Muslim audiences sort of picked up on it. I mean, essentially, we never had a presentation in such a detail of a daily life of a Muslim family or a tribe in the way that the show's portrayed. And also, there's other dynamics at play as well that you could look at alternatively in the way that there's a lot of crossover in between the language. There's words that are very familiar to South Asian Muslims particularly. And it's also created an awakening in terms of understanding the Turkic history of South Asia itself, not just as these were Muslim rulers, but the culture that they also brought as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, not only that, the first thing, there's two things that are interesting for me in regards to Ertugrul. When I was young, I mean, I've said this to Asim before, there was a show called The Sword of Tipu Sultan. I don't know if any of you guys remember that show. It used to come on Channel 4 as a child, and when I was a child, and it was exceptionally popular. And as a child, I was, just so in tune with that show. My father and I would watch that show together in particular. And, Tipu for us became a particular hero. He was somebody from the Asian subcontinent. He was somebody who I could subscribe to as being somebody from that part of the world. And it was very rare for me as a young child to see any positive Muslim representation. And this was on mainstream British television, right? So this is not the first time this has happened in our history, in the modern period, in the last couple of generations. But it's fair to say that in the last few years, for sure, Ertugrul as a TV show has done something which other TV shows haven't done in regards to the depiction of Muslims in particular. Muslim depiction in mainstream Western media is very negative. It's pejorative. We're perceived as terrorists, people who are backwards and so forth. That's no different in other mainstream mediums like Bollywood. It's the same. The depiction of Muslims is very negative. And even depictions of Muslims in Muslim countries were presented as apologetic and so forth. And really to see this narrative of what you could call a reflection of an international sort of like Muslim who resonates with all was unique. And it wasn't only Ertugrul that resonated with people. It was a lot of things in regards to the Muslims being the protagonist, the way that women are represented in the show, the way that good and evil is very clear, the idea of morality, the idea of being upright, the idea of leadership. And these are all things that Muslims are yearning for right now, right? Especially the idea of looking towards upright leaders. And then you can see this in Muslims. When Muhammad Salah scores a goal and does sujood, it makes us excited. I mean, it's kind of strange to see.
Especially us.
Yeah, especially
as Liverpool fans.
But, it's very strange that a footballer scores a goal and does sujood. I mean, like, what is that? I mean, I don't do that every time I finish a book when I'm writing an article. And technically I should, as an academic who's studying ilm, every time I finish a page, technically that should be the act that I do. But a footballer is doing that. And why do we resonate with that? Because I feel like there is a clear lack of leadership within the Muslim community, whether that's global or local. And Ertugrul somehow showed, not just in terms of defeating what is perceived as clearly good and evil, but just in his character, in the way he presents himself within a particular framework of Muslim masculinity. I see why people, resonated with that. And that's why I can understand the show.
That's a very interesting point about Muslim masculinity. I just wanted to come back on the idea of one of the things that a lot of people have problems with in terms of Ertugrul. I mean, I think there's two things that you can bring up. Number one is they feel like it's a political project, that this is sort of the current Turkish state has a project to sort of not to sort of assimilate or to sort of build a rapport of itself with the whole of the Muslim world, and it's using media as a way to facilitate that. And that's why you had sort of Arab reservations. I mean, I think, wasn't it, I don't know, the UAE or someone released their own version, their own Ertugrul or something that sort of came back on the back of that. So how I guess how Turkic or how Turkish, and another thing is how Islamic would you say the show is? I mean, one of the problems we have is, you know, when you release like Islamic media, it's really mediocre usually. Yeah. It's like, there's a thing, I remember when Jonathan Brown said something, he goes, you know, the guy's funny, not Muslim funny, which is like that we have such low standards. Like the guy has a beard and cracks a joke about namaz. It's like, oh yeah, that's really funny, even if it's not. And this show has like got more of a mainstream appeal beyond the Muslim audience. So I guess like, you know, the reservations about the political project, and just to see this as a mainstream show rather than an Islamic show, how would you?
I think I'll answer the second question first, which is that if you see Muslim representation in just mainstream popular culture and media, it's very little. I mean, the fact that the majority of us as Muslims are reduced to doing these sort of live feeds and podcasts in particular is an indication of the narrow scope that we have in regards to talking about Islam. Whereas in the West and countries that are states and so forth, they use popular culture, music, movies, television, the internet, social media. It's a machinery, it's a juggernaut, right? Often supported by either a hegemonic West or, like, let's just say a state like India and so forth. And so for Muslims, we're very disjointed in the way that we can represent ourselves on the media platform. And the options are very limited in regards to, we don't have a Muslim equivalent of the BBC. We don't have a Muslim equivalent of the New York Times. We don't have a Muslim equivalent of Hollywood as an industry. We don't have the Muslim equivalent of a talk show host. We don't have a Muslim equivalent of, you know, BBC Radio 4. So what I mean is our options as Muslims means we have to get very creative in the way that we represent our interests. And in that sense, Ertugrul became a show that was on Netflix. And that changed something. Now, Netflix put it up not realizing the popularity of the show and not realizing what it was going to do. The show initially was designed purely for a Turkish audience. As I said, it wasn't designed for an international Muslim audience. But the values of what they represented for Muslims in Turkey was no different than the values Muslims look for in any other country around the world. I mean, in that sense, we can all subscribe to the idea of haqq and batil. We can all subscribe to the idea of the imagination of what the Ghazwa might have looked like. We can all imagine, you know, what it means to be a good husband and a good wife, and what it means to be, you know, somebody that is striving for the haqq in that sense, and somebody who's upright, who has principles, who has values. And these are all things that we learn throughout our childhood as Muslims. And we want to see that in the visual form. And there was a TV show that did that. And so, in fairness, Ertugrul Ghazi as a show is a reflection of us in terms of how we feel. And that's what we should take from the show, not in terms of how great the show is, but why is it that we resonate with it? Why is it that it means so much to us? I mean, I have Muslims who come to Istanbul all the time. I take them to the tomb of Fatih. I take them to the tomb of Abdul Hamid. I take them to the tomb of Sulaiman the Magnificent. I mean, Fatih conquered Istanbul. Abdul Hamid and Sulaiman are Khalifas. But people want to go to see the tomb of Ertugrul. That's the tomb they want to see, right? And these are, I mean, what I'm saying is I'm presenting them giants of Islam. I'm taking them to the tomb of ulama. I'm taking them to the tomb of Ayub al-Ansari. But they want to see Ertugrul, which is an indication that Ertugrul is a reflection of how they feel in the world that they live in right now and how they want to feel. And as you make the point, it's the izzah. People want to feel a sense of izzah, and Ertugrul as a show gave them that sense of izzah. And so when they're going to Ertugrul Ghazi, it's not a reflection of Ertugrul Ghazi per se, because we really know very little about him. It's a reflection of the izzah that we want to feel. We want to feel a sense of izzah, right? And so that's why the show resonates and it works. And that's why I understand it. And I don't have a problem with it. But sooner or later, we need to transfer the izzah that we feel and manifest it in all of Islamic history. Because we have many great leaders, many great thinkers, and many great activists throughout the Muslim world, and ulama and thinkers and women who require equal attention in that sense.
I think it's interesting you mentioned it that way, where Muslims are currently, because the resonance, interestingly, even with within the Middle East, if you look at the tomb of Salahuddin in Syria. It was not actually in great condition towards the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And as things had progressed, as the nation states had developed, they actually massively sort of re-established its foundations and decoration and everything. And that showed that where the Islamic world saw itself in terms of the colonial sort of projects going on at the time, he was particularly fashioned to be a liberator from all of that in the last sort of time they had that experiment happen with them. And looking at it in terms of the giants that you mentioned, of course, you know, they're probably the more contemporary, probably the more relevant ones to European Muslims, for example, because they had a direct connection with many of the people, particularly this side of Europe. I think that the resonance, particularly with the first side of things from Osman Ghazi and his father, is mainly because of the establishment side of things. They literally re-established what they thought was another empire, an Islamic empire. And I know often it's said that it's a re-establishment of a Turkic empire, but actually their whole empire was so mixed, even at the time when the Seljuks were fighting the Byzantines with the Sultan Alparslan, there was actually some Turks on the other side as well. So it was never primarily seen as a Turkic thing in its day, despite the sort of ethnography of their sort of propaganda and stuff. But there was something interesting we just touched on, which is the Islamic masculinity side of things, which I think there's an interesting dynamic in the way that each role of the masculine side is portrayed on the show, which is very different to how we see in the West. In the West, it's promoted as you could have
Deadbeat dad.
I mean,
Violent, abusive husband.
a very flawed human being. To be human, you have to be flawed, and
and especially the masculine is always flawed, whereas the feminine will always be empowered.
The feminine is always subdued, and then is empowered, and then it's sort of coming out. Whereas on the show, a lot of these questions are already put to rest with the fact that you see the main protagonist as a son, as a brother, as a father, as a husband. And the nice thing with the representations of every character, they're multifaceted as well. There's equally as many fans out there, I think, of his companions as there were of one of the biggest villains on the show, Saadettin, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
There was literally, there's videos on some of his famous quotes. And what it shows there is that all of these people think that they're good. Every one of them think that they're doing the right thing. Someone is very material, someone is very spiritual. And there was something very interesting that Ustad Muhammad Gilan once said. He said he doesn't see it as a show, and it's more of a school. And in that regard, there's a lot of people that I spoke to about it that said exactly the same thing. There's a lot of things within it. There's particularly, I have English friends and colleagues who've even seen it. And some have questioned me about sort of, I had no idea this was a part of Islamic history, or I didn't realize they weren't just all about swords and conquest. They actually wanted security.
I mean, what's interesting is the point you make is, like, you know, especially in the way that, whether rightly or wrongly, there's an element of humanizing these characters, right? And I think for Muslims in particular, when we talk about Islamic history, and I've said this before, because we study very little of Islamic history, the humanization of these characters that we look at in regards to Islamic history is redundant for us. And here we saw a TV show where the human being was in the flesh to us. We could see it for the first time in a very long time. And that's why I said, when I was young, I saw Tipu Sultan. Now, the thing about Tipu Sultan is it was mainly done on his resistance against the occupation. But what you see here is, as you said rightly, you saw him you see Ertugul as a husband, as a son, as a father, and so forth, right? Now, as a historian, like I said, I don't watch much of the show because for me as a historian, there's going to be continued moments of critique. But as I said to you before, I recognize the importance of the show as a metaphor, right? And sometimes it's intriguing. I've said this before, you can talk more truth in fiction than you can in reality, right? And what the show is doing is, it may not be necessarily a show presented on facts, but it's a show that speaks truth in many moments. And it's truths that Muslims need to listen to in terms of what it means to be an upright Muslim and whatnot, and what the expectations are, what it means. So an interesting question is unity, a question that Muslims continuously ask in today's day and age. What does it mean to be unified as an ummah? And here we saw a group of people who bonded together, who band together, and then they go on particular projects. And that's something, once again, that Muslims are visualizing. Now, the thing is the show should be used as a platform, to be honest with you. Now, whether there are going to be other shows in the same vein is interesting to see. But nonetheless, the interesting thing is that as long as it pushes Muslims to learn more about their historical past, I'm satisfied with that.
I mean, I was just thinking in terms of, you spoke about this idea of depiction and representation of Muslim history. I mean, if we sort of juxtapose Ertugrul, which I haven't seen, by the way, so I'm like, I don't know, I'm here because, I don't know, for some reason, because I got you on, so I get that perk. But one thing we spoke about is the depiction of the Ottomans in a very famous movie that a lot of people aren't aware of. Pirates of the Caribbean is about Muslim naval commanders and Muslim naval soldiers, very pious. Jack Sparrow. I mean, I'm gonna hopefully let you expand on that a bit more. Who is Barbarossa? Who is Jack Sparrow? But there's a clear demarcation on how Ertugrul represents the Uthmani Khilafah and what was to come, and then how the West represented. And there's a sort of there's a harkening back to the days of, you know, the Great Turk, and with his harem and this horrible monstrous figure, terrifying the children, and we better go to sleep, otherwise, you know, Suleiman's going to come and get you, the Magnificent, or whatever. And that's still being played out, perpetuated again. So I mean, in terms of Orientalism and the European project and the position of media, I'd love to get just like a comparison between the two, and I'd love for you to expand on who Barbarossa actually was and Jack Sparrow.
So, I mean, what's interesting is, like, okay, so one of the interesting things when you see Pirates of the Caribbean in particular is you see, if you look at the clothing that they're wearing in particular, they are depictions of particular Muslim characters that existed in the past. And what's interesting is watch that from a particular Eurocentric point of view, Muslims have been depicted as being pirates, when in actuality Barbarossa was defending the sort of North African coast from the non-Muslims who were at times invading Muslim lands, and at times having skirmishes and so forth. And he is known to the one who sort of like brought Algeria and North Tunisia and Libya into the Ottoman fold. A loyal lieutenant, and I use this in the general sense, in that sense, not in the specific sense, to Suleiman al-Qanuni, and he's buried in Istanbul. But it's not only that. When you look at the narratives of Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, the narrative of Dracula comes about from the period of Fatih, and it's always the Ottomans that are depicted as the negative protagonists here. When there was a host of what you can say works of literature, Othello, for example, he's not an Ottoman, but he's a Muslim, right? And the way that Shakespeare has depicted Muslims throughout his work. Lord of the Rings. I mean, the villains in Lord of the Rings are supposed to be depicted in this image of the nasty Turk. And even when Brexit was happening, what was the Nigel Farage and the posters that were put out by the Brexiteers, which was the Turks are coming, right? And so what you see in the European imagination in particular is that there is a particular imagination that's ingrained, that these Turks, whoever they are in their imagination, these barbarians, these Saracens, and we see these words, are going to come and overhaul Europe. But Muslims who live in Europe don't have those imaginations, because to some degree, the majority of us who are in Europe are migrants to Europe. And so we are very disconnected from histories of our homeland, and we're not connected to the history of the countries that we live in. But people via osmosis who live in those lands, who are non-Muslims, have long imaginations in regards to, for example, in the British Parliament, when a rebellion takes place within the party, they're called the Young Turks. These are words that are ingrained within Western language that we should pay attention to in that sense. And this is why, once again, it's important to see how subtly, covertly, and overtly Muslims are represented within the narratives of Western media and so forth, and how we can try to pull away from that and then restructure our own narrative. And in that sense, once again, Ertugrul did something different. And
I just wanted to, we had a sort of question from a brother as well, and I sort of wanted to expand on this slightly. You mentioned about Barbarossa, who's the evil character in Pirates of the Caribbean, that he's actually a Muslim naval commander. But you mentioned something very beautiful about his name. It comes from the idea that he used to fast a lot, and he was a pious Muslim. And another just linked to that, this idea that Ertugrul, a brother asked as well. I mean, there's a claim now that Ertugrul was some pagan. He wasn't really a pious Muslim. It's all a lie. And the Ottomans and the early Ottomans were not. So how Islamic were these figures, and why do we have this imagination in our head that there's some sort of idol worshipping paganistic, or some monsters or whatever?
I mean, in to some degree, I mean, in all honesty, I would say Allah knows best. because I'm just trying to be safe. But we have enough evidence to suggest that these were people who, I mean, I'll give an example. If Ertuğrul is a pagan follower, and Orhan Ghazi, by the time he comes to power, is building madrasas, building mosques, building, tekhes and so forth. I mean, that transition is ridiculous, that transition can happen so fast from a pagan background. And the fact is, to detach people like Ertuğrul from the Seljuk past, from the Muslim past, this is to some degree a little bit disingenuous. Now, the point is that historians want to see documentation or the proof of somebody's Muslimness. That doesn't make sense to me, And I give an example. People make the case, for example, whether Yavuz Sultan Selim considered himself caliph. I mean, he doesn't need to say the word. I mean, the reality is he was one because he fulfills particular conditions. And this is one of the interesting things, which is the sort of frameworks which are used to describe the Muslimness of people throughout Ottoman history, whether it's Fatih was, somehow influenced by the Europeans, hence not a good Muslim, to Selim not really declaring he is a caliph, to the late Ottomans being secularists, to the early Ottomans being pagans. You can continuously see, and the concern I have is the Islam is being stripped out of them. Now, for Muslims, the concern is we don't have enough Muslim historians to contest that. They emotionally feel uncomfortable about that, but then they don't have the tools to say, wait, hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense, right? And so this is something that requires more Muslim involvement. Now in Turkey, we have a lot more Muslims who are challenging these narratives, but unfortunately, Muslims don't speak Turkish, so there's only so far we can go, right?
It's interesting you mentioned about the perception about, especially some of these things about Ertuğrul not being Muslim, and what I've noticed is a lot of people try to educate themselves, your layman, from comment sections, from anything lauding something. And when you see, for example, some of our neighbours from Pakistan in India, the comment sections is literally paid people to go on these comment sections, and literally, if Pakistanis at the moment, they're Ertuğrul mad at the moment over there. So within the comment sections, they'll try to dishearten them by saying, oh, no, he was a pagan, he followed an ancient Turkic religion and all sorts. And they will find anything that, in fairness, even to even them, there's a lot of literature that some of the Turks themselves wrote, and these were Turks that had a view, and I should say Turkish people who had a very strong pro-European, almost sort of an attitude to try and placate them, to say, actually, we're more European than our Asian sort of background is. And in an effort to do it, like you said, to strip away the Islamic side of things, they will paint certain aspects of their own history, from whether the word Osman was actually Osman, it was Ottoman, and all these other ridiculous things. And these are all ponderings that I found, especially if you look from an academic point of view, like you would see, especially from the view of Europeans, they often look for evidence, but they often forget that one of the biggest premises for these sort of research is absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Yeah. So if you have, you have an entire caliphate centered around Islam, you have a prior project, as in a way, I wouldn't say the word jihad was necessarily the Ghazwa. It was a Ghazwa deliberately used in those days, and that was the direct word for which they would derive the word Ghazi from. A lot of these things were Islamic principles, and you would never see where there was such a strong Islamic empire like the Seljuks previously, and obviously when they split and you have the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome. When you see these empires were historically and traditionally Islamic, you're not suddenly going to get a pagan from the other end of the empire, the frontiers, suddenly saying to all the Muslims, come and join me, and then we'll do the spoils, and if I feel like it, I'll join your religion. That simply didn't happen. I think there's another distinction in the previous side of things with the Khazars, quite often brought up, as they were another Turkic groups that had joined the Judaic religion, but that was very well written by the other side. And this is my point, that even the Christians and the Byzantines would mention that these were Muslims that they were fighting.
Point that you've made about the attempt to demotivate Muslims to some degree, and that concerns me a little bit. Look, whenever I teach Ottoman history, as Asim knows, and I teach Islamic history, I'm not absolving any blame from individuals that have committed particular acts or crimes and so forth. Human beings are going to do that. But the history of Islam is different than the history of what Muslims did. Yes, to some degree, it's true that a lot of the times we look at Islamic history from the purview of what Muslims do. But the point is, imagine you have a painting, right? And what people are doing is they're focusing on a brushstroke. And the emphasis is this obsession on this one person and that brushstroke, and then they reflect Islam as well. And what one should do is take a step back and look at the whole painting. And so this is why, like, even in regards to Ertugul Ghazi, Islam or the history of Ertugul Ghazi should not be restricted to Ertugul alone. It's what's happening in the period at the time, and what you're starting to see is a humongous advancement and transformation within Islamic societies, of which Muslims are advancing into the areas of what you would call Rumeli and European areas. And an advancement of that gradually is the Beylik of Osman Ghazi and Orhan Ghazi, to the conquest of Bursa, to the conquest of Edirne, to the conquest of Kosovo, and then the establishment of Istanbul, and then the creation of the Ottoman Caliphate. These, I mean, there's no need to strip any of this away from its Muslim agency in that sense. And so what happens with Muslims is they are made to believe that they are just as bad as everyone else, because one of the problems that Muslims, I feel, have is because we lost intellectual and political agency, the only superiority we had left was the moral superiority. And so now people go after our morality as a way of showing that our morality is no different than the morality of anyone else. But in reality, what Muslims need to do is understand, by looking at their history, that the history of Islam is absolutely amazing in many ways. And when you look at it in the bigger picture, you can see, yes, Muslims here and there have committed transgressions, but the culture of Islam's always brought people back to the center. It always cleaned them up. So in that sense, I mean, once you have a more meta view of what's happening throughout Islamic history, you can then start to move on from that. And this shows, like, as you said, the comment sections, that Muslims are so detached from their history that it makes them nervous because they don't have the information. The question is, why don't they have the information? And this is what we need to change. Because I've always made the case that Ottoman studies in particular is a Western enterprise. Why is it that most of the universities in America, for example, have Ottoman studies departments? You go into a madrasa around the Muslim world and there's no mention of Ottoman studies, which is 600 years of Islamic history. What's gone wrong here? So this is why I encourage Muslims to study more of their history. It's important.
One of the things you mentioned there is this attack on morality, and one of the things you see, I haven't watched Ertugrul, but I have Sarge on WhatsApp, and he's always putting up statuses, and you see clips, and there's some really crazy violence that's happening in the show, and so this idea of what we mentioned before, the Ghazw, this idea of holy war that the Muslims would undertake, and in the defense of the Muslim interests, and also in terms of conquest that was taking place. And this has been a bone of contention for a very long time, especially in the age we live in the so-called, the liberal peace that we're in now, where everybody's really nice and depressed, really, but nevertheless, at least we're not killing each other. And then, so there's this idea that, these Muslims, they were these crazy guys, they used to go around killing people, Islam was spread by the sword, and they will maybe, I don't know if people do use, but they could point to this TV show and say, here's an idea of this violent Muslim going around attacking, etc., etc. I mean, you beautifully explained the Ghazwa to us in our lessons, and I'd love for you to expand on that slightly. How did the Muslims themselves at that time see the violence they were undertaking, and was it some sort of nefarious activity?
The interesting thing is that I think one of the things that I've realized, just generally as somebody who teaches history and just the nature of human beings, is we don't understand, or we have a lack of understanding of the nature of violence itself. And is all violence the same, and is violence universal? Now, in regards to Muslims, by and large, what it seems to be when you look at the culture of Ghazw is to remove any physical obstacles that are in the way, to restrict the sort of like what you could call the advancement of Islam. But there's never been a decimation of cultures, societies, and peoples. That just didn't happen. And we can see the case of India, we can see the case of Balkans. What usually happens is any physical forms of what those people at the time believed as being unjust governance or corruption was removed physically by some level of contestation, which wasn't necessarily only restricted to Muslims, by the way. This was the worldview that people were practicing at the time. And Muslims came in and they did what they thought was necessary in regards to the safeguarding of their interests in the state. And they haven't compelled, or they didn't compel, from what I can see, people to become Muslim. That's very clear. So, the problem is that the narrative, even now regarding the Ghazw and the way that it's presented from Islamic history, is to force Muslims to deny it existed. And if it existed, to be embarrassed of that particular reality. And yet, when we look at the manner in which Western governments sometimes operate in regards to what they're trying to do around the world, they're given a green light. And I think it's not the same. And I personally think that we need a proper conversation in terms of what was happening in that moment of Islamic history. I think we need a mature conversation amongst Muslims in regards to that.
I think the interesting thing that they present from the show, from almost an ideological point of view, is that just what kind of circumstances the Muslims at that time were facing. There was, of course, there was the push from the Byzantines to get their land back, and they were involved in many intrigues. And we can see neighbourly intrigues into kingdoms. If you look at, for example, from our own history, there was a ruler, Maharaja Jaipal Shah, at the time of northern India during the time of Mahmud Ghazni. And the way that history is, for example, presented amongst a lot of the Hindu and Orientalist sort of aspect. And when I say the Hindu, I mean particularly the extremist side of things.
Hindutva.
The Bhaktis. They will present it as that this was a valiant king who was just harassed by this Turk who came in and took everything over. And they don't realise that if you look at their own history, this particular king used to finance intrigues into the state of Ghazni very, very frequently to influence who the next king will be. And at this point,
and the Byzantines, they would have because the Ottomans were always seen, right, as like some sort of buffer state to protect the Muslims against the Byzantines. So their job wasn't to sort of, like you're saying, like there was always a Byzantine threat that they were there to sort of shield.
And that threat is global as well as local. So locally they would influence particular tribes, there were particular governors, lords of those areas to rise intrigues. But then also they were constantly on the lookout for recruitment of people within the Muslim empire who they can co-opt. And that's one of the strong themes on the show, is that where there's a hater, there's always a traitor. Every single place you're constantly going to find it, whether it's a family or else.
What was the line? Wherever there's a hater, there's a traitor.
Yeah.
Oh, could you make that up?
I'm completely trademarking that one.
Okay.
Which is
for me, the point is this: is like if Muslims are going to try to look at the historical past from the moral goggles that they wear in today, then in reality they have no historical past, right? What it's important for me as a person who teaches history and Islamic history in particular is to try to explain the complexities of human beings, human society, the complexities of war, the complexities of changing borders, changing frontier regions, power, and so forth, and then to help them understand what was happening at that world at that time. And if one's going to take these moral glasses and put them on, then we can't study any history of anything in that sense, right? It just all has to be cancelled. And so what we're trying to do is trying to say, look, take it easy, just understand what was happening at that moment of history at that particular time, and we have to appreciate for what it was.
It's interesting from where you're saying about the lens that we look at history through, particularly the moral lens. I even find that that's been quite problematic as a Muslim to look at, because a lot of the history that's written, particularly in English, is written with a narrative and almost not just an inference, but an insinuation completely that the good side were the Christian European side. You will almost never hear from there the constant warring states that they had amongst themselves, but their own intolerance to anybody different from them as well. For example, that when the Protestants were going through the middle of Europe, there was lots of other sort of denominations of Christians that found safe haven with the Ottomans. And the whole kind of narrative with how that the violence even, for example, is presented, but without looking at what was going on. I mean, these guys went through Mongol onslaughts. They were literally ravaging the Islamic world. They absolutely ravaged the Islamic world. You had, aside from the Byzantine, you constantly had Crusaders coming for round 3, round 4, round 5. And with all these
attacking themselves.
Literally. And then you've got a group that says, literally, do you know what, we'll take them all on. And the way that they structure their violence is purely for the sake, and they repeat it repeatedly on the show, that almost with a caveat, that none of this is for its own sake. We are doing this to allow people not just to have a breather, but to allow everyone, whether they're Muslim or not, to have a breather. And they were aware we're in non-Muslim lands, we have to take care of them as well. And the institutions that they were trying to establish in terms of justice, they were very careful. And this comes into where the Ottomans established even a millet system, like we can't apply our law to them, when their own systems and morality are very relative to their own culture growing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you make regarding the Mongol invasion and the Crusaders is important, because there are prolonged periods and moments of violence in which respite is very little. And when you're living in a world which is exceptionally violent of that nature, the only way to survive violence is to have a particular form of violence that gives you security. And so in that sense, you can see the type of frameworks and mindset that these people were in. It was a very violent world, and in that sense, there are exceptional complexities, not only external forms of violence, but internal, as you said, contestations of power and intrigue, right? And in that sense, it's difficult to know whether Ertugrul Ghazi was promoting these concepts of justice or not. But what's clear is that in the Ottoman context, for sure, we see that there is a culture amongst the ulama in particular that makes sure that justice is a central theme and component of good governance. And that's throughout. Now, if they went out of line, which on some occasions they did, the culture was brought back to the fore and say, hey, hang on a minute, this is our culture, this is what we abide by. So the fact that that culture exists in the works of thinkers and ulama up until the end is an indication that while the reality and the ideal might be different at times, nonetheless, there was an ideal that they expected governance to uphold. And that was important. And the importance of having that ideal is that while you may not be able to reach it, you still should be working to strive for it. And that was a constant, in what you see in Ottoman studies, that is sometimes missing when we're looking at Ottoman studies. And that's because for mainstream Ottoman historians, that's not an important question for them. It is an important question for Muslims, but Muslims don't engage in Ottoman studies. And so this is where you have the situation. By and large, I've noticed in regards to Ottoman historians is that they will investigate and study on fields and questions that are significant to them in the way that they see the world. And so it's only natural that they're going to find the world that they see from their perspective in the history that they're looking at. And as a result, as you said, like Muslims are asking very different questions. But the type of questions Muslims are asking, we're not seeing them in the works of Ottoman studies because there are very few Muslims studying Ottoman studies. And this is part of the problem.
That's a very good point, actually. I'm just thinking, because I study economic history, and if you look at how the Ottomans are depicted in economic history, because they're not a capitalist neoliberal empire, they're just seen in a wholly negative light. It's horrible how the depictions are. But I wanted to come to some of the questions that some of the brothers have asked, and I found this one very interesting. I remember I was in uni in my undergrad years, which were not long ago, but I was walking and I saw these two Salafi brothers, and Salafis, there's this like historic antagonism to mainstream tasawwuf. They don't like Sufism, they see it with some sort of reservations. And so I see these two brothers walking to go to the prayer room, and suddenly one of them turns around and goes, Akhi, you watch Ertugul? And the guy's like, yeah, nah, what's this Ertugul? Nah, bro, there's this guy called Ibn Arabi. And I was like, if you knew what your mashayikh said about Ibn Arabi. But I wasn't going to tell them. So there's even this sort of like, and so somebody's asked in the comments as well about the role of Ibn Arabi and within the early Ottoman state, Ertugrul specifically, did he not meet him? And even if he didn't, Sufism. I mean, there was no idea that the Ottomans could see an Islamic reality beyond the world of Sufism, beyond the Ghazalis, beyond the Ibn Arabis. These were part and parcel, bread and butter, imbued within their culture. Every Ottoman Sultan had a sheikh, Adabali, the idea of the foundational sheikh of the Ottoman Empire. I think I just want to I'd love for you to just broach that as a topic.
Yeah, sure. So the question of whether Ibn Arabi in particular met Ertugrul Ghazi, the chances of that is very unlikely. They were on two different parts of the world, and they spoke two very different languages, and the interaction between them would have been unlikely. But did they exist roughly around the same time? Yes, they did exist roughly. I think what the makers of the show wanted to do was trying to give a sort of like physical depiction of Sufism beyond just the characters of Ertugrul by having somebody who's relatable with people. And Ibn Arabi is a known figure that many Muslims know, and so they wanted to give him a physical representation in the show, rather than just bringing a Sufi, sheikh that nobody knows. I'm assuming, I'm second guessing what the producers of the show were doing, but there's no doubt that, and not just the Ottomans, but in that period of Islamic history, whether it's the Seljukian period, the latter Abbasid period, and the Ottoman period in particular, the Tasawwuf culture is exceptionally strong in the Muslim world at the time, in which there are multiple Sufi tariqats, in which multiple leaders of the various principalities and beyliks, and even the Ottoman Khilafah to some degree, are framed within a culture which is close to Tasawwuf culture and Sufis and sheikhs and so forth. You're right, the majority of the Ottoman leaders of state up until, you can say, the collapse of the Ottomans were close to Sufi sheikhs. You can see this in the case of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Now, Abdul Hamid is more unique in that sense. Abdul Hamid is continuing a particular tradition. There's an evolution of the different types of Sufi tariqas that find ways of being close to power. But throughout the history of the Ottoman state, you can see that Sufism is something which is synonymous with power in particular, which is often not spoken about, which is the role of Sufism regarding power in that context, and the role of in the dynamics of society and the dynamics of social consciousness and Islam and so forth. And there's a lot of works that indicate that's the case. So, I mean, this is undeniable.
That's very interesting, seeing the case with modern Sufism, which has become suddenly very apolitical and quietist, and but I mean, if you wanted to,
it's become very cultish in a lot of ways, and in particularly without, I mean, certainly won't mention any names, but there's a frustration. There's a frustration at the moment. The Sufism that you read about in the books isn't necessarily what is being translated in real life here. And with the characters of the show, there's a lot of accepted cultish behaviours we see today that aren't on the show, and that are more orthodox in the way that you would expect.
Sanitized Sufism, in a sense.
Well, I wouldn't say sanitized. I would probably say that it's more.
This is real Sufism.
Yeah, and in a perspective that even a Salafi could look at the show and say, well, if that's the Sufism you follow, I've got no beef with that.
I mean, what the makers of the show, I think, are trying to do is to show that during that moment in time in history, like the sort of distinction between Tasawwuf culture and everyday life was very hard to distinguish. In that sense, it was in every part of people's lives. It's only now in what do you call it, during the formation of the nation state, more specifically, that there has been a narrowing of a focus of what it means to belong to the world of Sufism. But in that period of history, it would have been exceptionally blurry. I mean, how do you make distinction between something which is normative Islam and something which belongs to the world of Sufism? It would have been impossible to do that. And so you can see this in every moment of Ottoman history. I mean, like, let's look at the Sheikh Shamil revolts. I mean, these are Sufi revolts.
Yeah.
The resistance against the Russians from the Ottoman forces, mainly the people that are encouraging the soldiers to fight are from the Naqshbandi class. The Ottoman military reformation that take place in the 19th century, these are Naqshi-inspired reformation processes. I mean, resistance in Algeria is done by Sufi tariqats. Resistance in Libya, when we see this in terms of in that sense, I think that we have to move away to some degree of the binary that's somehow being created in this current period, and just accept that tasawwuf as an ideal is something that everyone should subscribe to. And that was something very clear in the way that it was infused in everyday life at that period at the time.
You touched a little bit on the Reformation at the time in the army, and just before the Reformation, when they had established a very strong tradition of the Janissaries that was set up, they were originally very strongly Bektashi, and obviously they went through various different sort of phases and things. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought about the end of their sort of movement, and why the necessity for a Reformation even came about?
By the 19th century, what we start to see is that the Ottomans in particular, so I've made this case before with Asim, which is one of the interesting things regarding the Seljuks is the sort of like the revival of Sunnism in particular, which the Seljuks and the Mamluks to some degree bring to the
Imam al-Ghazali and
so forth, right? And so you can see that one of the things that the Turkic peoples have done is once again bring Sunnism to the table in a particular shape and form. And one of the things we see in the 19th century is the particular framing of Sunni orthodoxy that takes place once again within the Ottoman domains. So there's this huge narrative that the late Ottomans are secularizing, and yet at the same time there's an alternative narrative that the late Ottomans are Sunniizing along an orthodox framework. So, I mean, it sounds kind of strange. How can the two happen at the same time?
Contradictory.
Right. Now, what we see in the period of Mahmud II is his abolishment of the Janissaries in particular, also led to the abolishment of what he was made to believe were tariqats which were not in line with a particular orthodox Sunni views, of which the
Ahlul Bid'ah, in a sense.
Right, the Bektashi were one of those orders who had given a spiritual sort of like strength to the Janissary order to some degree. The Mevlevis were also considered at one point to some degree, because the Ottomans were going...
By the Mevlevis, you mean the followers of Maulana Rumi?
Yeah, that's right. But they were left, and we see a huge influence of the Naqshbandis in regards to the idea of Sunni orthodoxy regarding the political system and Sunnism. So what we're seeing is a revival or a turn towards orthodox Sunnism because of the influx of the Naqshis in particular, and that happens after the abolishment of the Janissary. So this is really fascinating in that sense, So the assumption that there is a somehow decline regarding Islam in the latter period, we're seeing something else here.
I think what's really interesting is this idea of the Sunnism, and I'd love to broach that slightly. The Ottomans always saw themselves, or there's a good idea that they saw themselves as representatives of Sunni Islam. And there was all these attempts to sort of clean up the Muslim world, to remove heterodox groups. But at the same time, but then at the same time, you sort of see the wars they fought with Muslim lands. So I'd love to, just to bring up like a case study. So Yabu Salim, Sultan Salim, rahmatullah alayh, he fights the Shia in the Safawi Shia, and is it the Kizilbash? There's that revolt that takes place at the same time. And when he frames that, it's not a political war for him, or is it? Is he fighting that as a religious war? Was he fighting that as a Sunni Muslim, or is he fighting that as an Ottoman caliph? Or are the two things not dissimilar?
I think, one of the problems we have is that when we see the sort of like when we see the inter-Muslim contestations, that's a very modern phenomenon. So even in Saddam's Iraq, you didn't see Sunnis and Shias fighting the way that happened after the American invasion. But what we do see is that the particular contestation between Selim and let's just say the Safavids in particular was one mainly down to the frontier regions in which the Safavids were sort of like pushing into the Ottoman domains. And so the distinction between political and religious is at that time indistinguishable. You can't distinguish between the two, right? So the Safavids are encroaching upon Ottoman territory, and so as a result of that, Selim is not only dealing with the need to crush the Safavids, but what's intriguing is when Selim had the opportunity to wipe out the Safavids, he didn't, but he did wipe out the Mamluks in one way, right? So and what's intriguing is his son Suleiman al-Qanuni, when Selim had kicked out all of the people who were aligned to the Safavids or were of a particular inclination of Shiism, Suleiman allowed them to return. So, it's difficult to say that this was a rivalry between Sunnis and Shias. What you see is this is a particular political rivalry but it's difficult to distinguish between the ideology, if you want to call it that, or the worldview of the political elites and class, and religion and politics. But for sure, they could have wiped out the Safavids if they wanted to, but they didn't. And in World War I in particular, what's interesting, when we talk about the idea of Ittihad Islam, for example, the Iranians and the Ottomans worked together to try to resist the British occupation. There are many instances where Sunnis and Shias are working together in regards to resisting foreign interests.
I mean, just to come back to Ertugul one more time, and I think maybe we'll depart from the show slightly in our conversation after that, is one of the brothers asked a question about the Mongols and their relationship with what were the Mongols doing in the time of Ertugul Ghazi, and what role did they play in the Islamic world?
It's a difficult one. I mean, to say by the time Ertugul Ghazi becomes, or we're saying that the rise of the Kaya tribe and mainly the Seljuks of Rome, the Ilkhanids are now a known entity in the Anatolian region, right? And by now they've become Muslim, which is very unique in that sense. And this is something which has always been unique about Islamic history, but about the Mongol invasion in particular, which is the Mongol invasion decimated the Muslim world, but then the Mongols became part of the Muslim world, right? And this is why the idea of Islam, while Islam is dependent on leadership and authority, at the same time, Islam can still survive independent from leadership authority so long as it's manifest in the people in that sense. And that authority and leadership will always find its way sooner or later within the Muslim community. So even after the Mongol devastation, which is an exceptional devastation, and even though the Mongols come to existence in mainland Anatolia by the end of it, you start to see the emergence of Muslim entities trying to create a particular state. And this is the conversation we had before between Bayezid Yildirim, which is the Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, who tries to unify Anatolia and agitates the Mongols. And in return, we have repercussions with Timur-Lenk, right? And Timur then sort of brings on his front foot aggression. And you see a unique moment in Islamic history where two great leaders go to war with each other. Now, if
Two great Sunni leaders even.
yeah, and what's interesting is if you are a
Turkic as
historian of Ottoman history, or somebody who has an emotional attachment to the Ottomans at least, you see Timur-Lenk as somebody who's exceptionally negative. But go to Uzbekistan and Timur is seen as a hero.
Oh, God,
So,
they've
you know,
deified him over there. They
of
literally.
course.
I mean, that in itself is quite a problematic thing in the sense that, funny enough, and I'm probably going to be a bit controversial here, but of all the people for a nation state just freeing itself from communist Russia, the first person they picked was Tamerlane. And Emir Temur was particularly controversial, even according to Islamic history in itself, in that he literally some of the things that he did from a moral point of view is very easy for us in hindsight to criticize.
Very easy.
Very easily today. But one of the funny things was that these were two burgeoning empires, and there's a really good book that I would get anybody to read by Justin Morosi about Emir Temur.
The Age of Tamerlane.
There's a lot of information in there that he went all the way to Uzbekistan to speak with them about. And one of the particular funny things in there was that when initially he, I think, was a little bit more calm when he spoke to Bayezid to say about these issues they were having. And then this is where the issue about the Kai lineage of the Ottomans had come into place, because he said, I am Temur, I come from this particular tribe, and I come from the tribe that bore Genghis Khan and all sorts. Whereas at that time, and I know Dr. Halil Inalcek, it says in his book that he doesn't believe that, or that he doesn't have any evidence that they had lineage from that side. My take's always been on it, well, regardless of whether the Ottomans were Kais or not, the fact they were Ottomans superseded any sort of achievements they had previously anyway.
So the interesting thing about this point is the first part to your question is that when Bayezid and Timur get into an interaction, what's intriguing here is the assumption, you know, the Eurocentric narrative and even the later Ottoman narratives of Bayezid is to critique Bayezid to some shape or form. So they presented Bayezid as somebody who was under the thumb of his wife, somebody who had become a drunkard, as a way of absolving themselves of the reason why Bayezid had lost to Timur-Lenk. One of the main reasons why Bayezid lost to Timur-Lenk is because he had disenfranchised so many of the local tribal leaders by centralizing the domains that they moved towards Timur-Lenk and provided Timur-Lenk with the extra support he needed to fight Bayezid. And then when some of them joined Bayezid and then Bayezid went to war with Timur-Lenk, they ran away from the war, leaving Bayezid hanging. But the narrative is that Timur-Lenk then starved.
Literally.
Yeah, but the narrative is that Timur-Lenk then starved Bayezid to death and put him in a cage, which is actually not necessarily true. Bayezid just probably died of natural health because Timur-Lenk would have kept him as a prisoner of war, and that would have been quite significant for him. So a lot of the narratives we see regarding Bayezid and Timur-Lenk are these particular imaginations of presenting these guys, with Bayezid's case as a drunkard, as weak, and so forth, and as Timur-Lenk as a barbarian, as a savage, and so forth. And in reality, we need to investigate the history a bit further, and you start to see something very different that's taking place, which is, as you said, two forms of power clashing amongst each other. And you're right, in the case of Bayezid may have made the claim that he was part of the Kaya tribe, but that wouldn't have been that significant. But saying that he was an Ottoman would have made more sense because they were a rising power.
I think the interesting thing with that was when they were almost sort of measuring each other in terms of I'm superior to you, he's superior to me, I'm superior to you, and eventually the threats it just got to a point. The interesting thing militarily speaking on it though was that whereas the Ottomans were very European centric in their sights, that they wanted to expand in that direction, and obviously the unsettling sort of policies that he had with the Anatolian Turks and the Beyliks that were there. The really interesting thing is that Emir Temur literally had spies all over the Ottoman territories. He literally ensured he knew his territory before he's even gone in. And some of the framework within that was, I think, the dynamic of him, the Ottomans fighting another Sunni as opposed to taking on the Shia of the Safavid side of things. I think this is an example and a demonstration that these were empires fighting each other. Of course, you will have ulama that will frame it differently. They will look through their perspectives. But these perspectives of the champions of one sect versus another, I think it was very hard to kind of justify it, given that they've.
I mean,
also
I think
had
there are
fights
some
amongst
clear
themselves.
examples where you do have, we are the Sunni defenders, etc., etc. I mean, even when they attacked the Mamluks, they had this idea that we are fighting because
In a just way.
they felt like the Mamluks weren't doing enough to stop Portuguese incursions into the Indian Sea. So
Yeah.
they're like, okay, we'll take that territory and we'll protect the Muslims in a way better than they did. At least that's how Salim framed it. Whether he actually believed it or not, Dr. Yaqoob will probably tell us.
I mean, look, the complexity is that we weren't there, so it's very difficult to know. And I agree with you. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why I'm saying this right now, because I live in Turkey and I often listen to Muslims who give me political analysis and opinions of what's happening in Turkey. And I live in Turkey and say that's far from the truth. But in 20 years' time, those are the opinions that will stick. Not the opinions that I give you, but the opinions that people have created for themselves. So in regards to the Ottomans, all of these things that you put forward are all possible. It's not, implausible that any of these things happen. But the unique thing about the Ottomans is there's an internal dynamic, as you said, between the old guard and the new guard. The old guard being the Turkic people who are the basis of the rising Ottoman dynasty, and then the new guard, which were the new groups of clients and Muslims and converts who were part of the areas of the Balkans and Rumeli. And so you're seeing this internal contestation of what it means to belong to the Ottoman domains. And then on the part of Timur in particular, I mean, what's interesting, and I've always said this because people always ask me the question of how the Ottomans collapsed. I mean, look how fast Timur's empire collapsed, rapidly. And it just shows you the fragility of power. And, I was making this case only last week. There was no way that last year anyone could have told you that Liverpool would have dramatically collapsed as a football club. You lose 4 defenders in a team, collapse overnight. The point I'm making is that power is very fragile. Power needs to present itself as being powerful. Power needs to present itself as being stable. Power needs to present itself as being strong. But you can see just by the loss of one leader, like let's just say in the case of Man United, you lose Alex Ferguson, your entities can collapse very quickly. And that's what I mean by the fragility of power, which is power presents itself as being strong, but power is fragile. And even now in the nation states that we have today, there's an assumption that these are going to be around forever. And yet an empire like the Ottomans in particular, which were around for 600 years, collapsed. So anything is possible. And this is what we need to understand regarding power, which is that what the Ottomans were successful at was they continuously reinvent themselves, continuously transform themselves and adjust to the changing times. And that was very unique, in which the Ottoman state, even after the defeat of Bayezid, were able to do that. And Timur-Len's state was unable to do that after the loss of the charismatic leader, which was Timur.
I mean, I'd love for you to expand on that slightly. One of the things, I mean, I think Shaykh Abdul Hakim speaks about this too. You mentioned the idea that the Timurid Empire, Timur dies, Shah Rukh takes over, slowly that empire dissipates if it ceases to exist. You spoke about Liverpool. I just want to say for the record, I mean, when we got hammered by Aston Villa, we had all our defenders there. I don't know, like, Allahu A'lam whether that would have made a difference. And so, Alex Ferguson used to be Manchester United manager, so just in case.
Was he the Scot dude?
The Scottish guy, yeah. But I just want to come into that, like this idea that why there's an, I don't know if it's true or not, but they say that the Ottoman Empire is the longest empire in the history of humanity.
Longest running dynasty.
Because the Japanese Empire, I think, is 2,000 years old, so that might have
The Romans lasted longer as well.
And the Romans as well.
But I think
okay.
it's the world's
So
longest
the
running
idea
dynasty.
is it's the longest form of power in one household.
And my question on the basis of that is, I mean, you sort of touched on it and maybe expand on it slightly, because before we come on to the next topic that's hitting the Islamic blogosphere this week, but is why was the Ottoman Empire able to persevere for so long? And Shaykh Abdul Hakim would make the argument of tasawwuf, and as believers, that's very important to us as well. That as representatives of Allah Ta'ala and His deen, Allah Ta'ala preserved them as long as their preservation was needed. And that's a very powerful point that as Muslims we should, وَلَا يَنْصُرَنَّ اللَّهُ مَنْ يَنْصُرُهُ, Allah gives victory to those who give Him victory. And that was always a sense that as long as they were functioning for the sake of God, Allah would continue, and like the Ibn Khaldun type analysis. But even on a more materialistic level, how were the Ottomans able to persevere for so long in the face of constant barrages of
I mean, you know what's interesting? There's an assumption to present that near the end of the Ottomans, when they collapsed, that somehow they had moved away from Islam, but that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, what's important to understand in Islamic culture, and I always try to teach this to my students, is that Islam has a requirement of Muslims being competent. The nature of competence is a requirement amongst Muslims. We do not celebrate mediocrity. We need to be people of meritocracy and competency. And what we see in the Ottoman domains is the Ottoman power structure wasn't dependent on the Sultan alone. It was a configuration of competent people which were ulama, military men, elites, thinkers, technocrats, and so forth. And your dawla, your society, your ummah are only as strong as the competent and intellectual people that you have within it. And so that's one of the reasons why the Ottomans were able to survive for so long, because they maintained that level of competency even while the world was changing. What's happened right now is that we can argue maybe that there is a particular intellectual deficit amongst Muslims right now. And that's an indication of a lack of competency of Muslims in particular fields. In the Ottoman case, the leader of the state had to be competent, or at least the advisors of the leader had to be competent in what they were doing. That's a standard Islamic requirement which is lost right now. And that's what the Ottomans were skilled at. They were competent in warfare, they were competent in decision-making, they were competent in statecraft, and they were competent in matters to do with ilm and tasawwuf and ulum ad-din. That's necessary. So when you lose that, the demise of something is very easy. And so once again, when I use this case of football or sports as an example, you need a competent manager, you need a competent board, and you need competent players. It doesn't matter how good you are, but if there's lack of competency. And then the point I'm trying to make here is that I'm not denying that maybe Allah Ta'ala removed his favor from the ummah at that particular time. I'm not denying that maybe people were not as compliant to Islam as they should be. But one of the things that people forget is that competency is a requirement for Muslims. And this is something that is part of the Islamic faith, you know what I mean?
I think. I mean, this brings us. I mean, we started with the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire, Ertugul Ghazi, and how that sort of is such a powerful imagination. I love how you always use this word when you teach as well. The idea of imagination, and something else that sparked the Muslim imagination very recently. If we go from the beginnings to the end, I mean, we just passed the 27th of Rajab, 100 years ago. On the 27th of Rajab was the announcement that the Ottoman Khilafah will no longer exist. And that was the collapse of the Ottoman Khilafah and the exile of the last Khalifa, rahmatullah alayh. And that's really picked up a lot of steam, at least in like the Muslim social media bubble, where a lot of Muslims are really talking about what did Khilafah mean? We used to have a Khilafah. Look at the state of us now. Look at Rohingya. Look at the Uyghurs in Turkey, in China. Look at Kashmir. Look at all these places. The lack of Muslim political force. I mean, you sort of touched on this before. I think this is a good chance to open up the topic. Why are now suddenly, I mean, we've lived in nation states, we've got the NHS, everything's meant to be hunky-dory, and we've got good jobs and middle class, but still there's a yearning in the heart for that great institution that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam bequeathed us. One of the most powerful things I read was the Manaqib. Somebody wrote a book on the virtues of Al Uthman, one of the ulama. I think Sheikh Yusuf al-Nabhani's got something in there as well. And one of the mentions it makes is these people have the trust. Allah has made them stewards of this trust, the Uthmani Khilafah. And one of the most, and it's heartbreaking to read it, but they say, and they will hold this until the Mahdi comes. Until Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam descends, and they will pass this trust into his hands. They believed it. They really believed that they would persevere until the coming, but they didn't. And right now as Muslims, there's this yearning still now for that great Khilafah that even in its most tepid form, they still miss it. And why do you think that is?
You know what's interesting is, as we mentioned, what I mentioned in the beginning was, I was saying there was a lack of leadership to some degree, and this is very evident. And when Muslims are continuously being politically and physically subjugated around the world and being treated as second-class citizens, it makes them wonder, you know, that they want to take agency into their own hands. Now, what's intriguing and what I found interesting was that when ISIS came into existence, there was an assumption among certain commentators in the West that this will be the end of the caliphate question for Muslims, because the caliphate was presented as a very violent and extreme political institution, and ISIS was presented as this particular medieval project, right? But what was intriguing was when we saw Baghdadi himself, his imagination fascinated me. Why? Because one, he tried to present himself as he modeled himself on the Abbasid Caliphate, the imagination of the Abbasid. The Ottomans was nowhere part of his imagination, and that's because he was a product of the sort of like Arab nation state. So the Ottomans were always negative for him.
And potentially, I mean, he also came from like a Wahhabi type ideology, which has always been antagonistic to the Ottoman project.
Okay, well, I didn't know that, so that's new information to me. But the second thing is he spoke about Sykes and Picot. the intriguing question that he puts forward is the Sykes and Picot agreement. And so the two imaginations he has of the Ottomans is one of non-existence and one of negativity. Now, the expectation was that Muslims were going to move away from this caliphate question and distance themselves from ISIS and distance themselves from Islam. In fact, what it forced Muslims to do is ask the question, what is the caliphate? And that was unique. And so younger Muslims who were being pressed into the corner to abandon this question started asking the question, well, what is the caliphate? And so some people said, hey, listen, the Abbasids were not the last caliphate, by the way. There was like 400 years of history in which Istanbul was the caliphate city. So in that sense, you start to, you know, for me as an Ottoman historian, I found it fascinating how Muslims started asking me this question. I was never expecting that. And then you say, yeah, okay, the Ottoman caliphate was like this from Selim's moment onwards to, you know, to Suleiman, to Abdul Hamid, and to the end. And so Muslims want to know more about a time in which they had political agency, they had political authority, and how they did good in the world, and they were an alternative. And I think Muslims should be allowed to ask that question, think about that question, and go into the historical past. And so that I find really fascinating that that's taking place right now. You know, I never expected that in my lifetime that Muslims would ask this question, and they are. So I think it's intriguing in that sense.
I think it's brought up a lot of interesting things as well, even in regards to current developments in Turkey. I know you spoke previously about the Hagia Sophia conversion to, well, I say conversion, but returned back to the masjid. And what was fascinating to me was how, for want of a better term, there was a lot of colonized minds within the Muslim community. And the way they framed this whole thing from a Western-centric morality, again, going back to the whole historic narrative that Muslims bad, Western good, and secularism good, Islamic or theism bad. And just how the way that, if, for example, a lot of these things, when you mention Khalif, it's always very traditional, very sort of medieval back in the mindsets. Whereas when you sort of discover there was literally within the last 1.5 centuries, there was an Islamic Khalif who turned around and literally defended the honor of the Prophet ﷺ against the French when they were doing stage plays, dishonoring him. And he literally threatened them. And it was done in such a diplomatic yet very firm way that they literally stopped their project overnight, literally almost overnight, the minute that this has happened. And this is in the zenith of the empire when it's going towards the end. And even at that state...
That point you make is fascinating. So it was Marxist writers in particular who, Weber in particular who coined the term Oriental despotism. In particular. And what he did is he shaped this idea with Marxist discourse that the notion of the Sultan is a pejorative term. And what's interesting is that word Sultan became a pejorative term and is stuck as a term that represented authoritarianism, which is not the case in the Ottoman period. If you speak to most Ottoman historians, they will tell you that the Ottoman political structure had constitutional traditions of checks and balances, and the Sultan was at the mercy of the political elites that existed at the time, which were the ulama, the janissaries, and people of the political class. In that sense, that imagination within Western literature to look at the Islamic past just by using the word Sultan as a pejorative term makes people embarrassed of their Islamic past in that context. And so it sort of detaches them from that. And so even now when people talk about Turkey today, they'll use, in the Western press, they'll put the word Sultan Erdogan, for example, as a way of turning him into a pejorative leader. Now, I'm not saying whether we should agree or disagree with Erdogan, that's anyone's choice, but the way the language is used is framed within a particular Eurocentric Islamophobic narrative, which is problematic for me as a historian, because not only does it disconnect him in regards to using a particular slur, but it also gives a very negative impression of Islamic history. So once again, when we see the works of Hussein Yilmaz, when we see the works of Mona Hassan, who look at different, Baki Tezcan, who look at different periods of Islamic history, who are not necessarily supporters of the idea of the caliphate, by the way, but they present the idea that this political institution was a lot more nuanced than people give it credit for, and that Muslims should have the right to speak about their Islamic past in a particular way that's relatable for them, and they should be allowed to ask about alternatives in the way that they place themselves in the world they live in. So I find that interesting, to be honest with you.
One of the things about the late Ottoman Khilafah that I think we can sort of bring to conversation today is that there's this idea, for example, we spoke about in the class as well, in like 1780, whatever it was, Tipu Sultan rahmatullah alayhi, as he's leading the fight against the British occupiers of India, he calls on the Uthmani Khilafah, I think it's Salim III or whoever it was at that time, that come assist me. And he says, I can't, because he's just been absolutely destroyed by the Russians in a war. And then there's other phases where the Philippines, they call on Sultan Abdul Hamid, and he says, I can't, because he's been. And then there's Ahmed Ubari, who raises the revolt against the French in Egypt, who calls on Abdul Hamid again, come help me, and he says, I can't. And the Bosnians. And there's this stage, even with the Khilafah, that there were moments when the Khalifa couldn't do what he was needed of him. When the Muslims were chucked out of Spain in the Reconquista, I think that was in the time of Selim. Was it Selim or Suleiman?
I think,
either of the two. And there's an idea that they're calling on the Khalifa to come and help, and he couldn't because he was stuck fighting another war at another time. I mean, is this like, if you can make an argument for pragmatism then, is there still room for an argument today when we see, for example, what's happening to the Uyghurs or the Kashmiris, and there's a sort of fragility or a weakness, or not an apathy, but there's just an inability of the Muslim leaders to enact their power in a way? And can we make that parallel? Is that anachronistic?
Okay, so they are different in some ways. I mean, all right, let's just go back to the case of Turkey, because I live here. Sometimes there's an expectation from Muslims who live in the Western world in particular, and who sit behind their keyboards on Facebook and Twitter, to sort of like project that Turkey should operate like a khilafah. It's a nation state. Let's understand its reality in terms of what it is. Even though they have a particular Muslim government in power, it's going to operate within the constraints of what it is. So I get the feeling sometimes that people are devoid of understanding the reality of what this country is, which is a particular nation state. And fundamentally, its interests are to protect its own interests, which are the people within its borders and its framework, right? And that's always going to be the case. And so in that sense, the expectation that certain Muslim countries can somehow step out and save Muslims from around the world is an indication that people don't understand international relations to a certain degree. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be applying pressure on particular Muslim states to uphold a particular form of morality and ethics in which they can try to safeguard Muslims to the best of our ability. But this is going to be a complicated situation and a complicated narrative, and there's no right or wrong here. And as you rightly put, there are many moments in Islamic history. Not only that, but we can go back as far as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah to see that there are times where your hands are tied in their particular restraints. That's not to make excuses for countries like Turkey. I still believe that Muslims should be speaking to countries like Turkey, Pakistan or whatnot, and trying to get them to find multiple channels to try to safeguard the interests of Muslims around the world. But at the same time, this is what the problem is without strong leadership. You don't have a particular leadership that can represent the interests of the Muslims. This is the mess we're going to be in. And so we need to ask ourselves, in order to get to be, we first need to maybe get our own house in order. And at this moment in time, our house is not in order. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And at the moment, the emotion is fine in terms of having that consciousness and that emotion. But at the same time, that consciousness, that emotion has to be placed. Look, this might sound strange for me, but I have always said that one of the problems we have regarding Muslims today is we either have a weakness in our understanding of Islam, or we have a weakness in our understanding of the reality. At times, we have a weakness in our understanding of the two. And so we have a very restricted understanding of Islam vis-a-vis how it operates in the world we live in. And we have a very shallow understanding of the reality in the way that we place ourselves in the world we live in. And when you're on these social media platforms, or you're using technologies which give you very binary answers to very complex and nuanced situations, sometimes we don't know what to do. Now, somebody like myself who lives in the Muslim world, we are having these conversations on the ground all the time. All of us want to see a change towards the plight of the Muslims that they're in at this moment. And we're trying to have multiple conversations, but unless we can create a particular consciousness where Muslims take responsibility themselves of the situation they're in and say enough is enough, I think the expectation that these states are going to somehow do what we want them to do is a little bit, it's wishful thinking. And I'm not trying to absolve the states from that. I'm just trying to say, that maybe we need to do things differently.
Sure.
I think interestingly, you mentioned bringing Turkey and Pakistan together. Recently, there's a project. I think they've announced a train project from Islamabad to Istanbul.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
and someone was mentioning like to go on a holiday, you go on an airplane, you wouldn't be going on a 2-week journey. But I think that's mainly for trade and manufacturing more than anything else from that side of things, isn't it?
It is mainly for trade and manufacturing, but it's also, as I've used this word before, the idea of creating a particular imagination. The reality is that it's trying to create, I think the idea is that particular, and I'm an Ottoman historian, but I'm just going to talk about this particular political scenario, which is that it's trying to create a particular imagination that certain states in the Muslim world are making particular changes of cooperation.
Yes.
And this is somehow changing the mindset of Muslims in particular parts of the world, in assuming that certain changes can take place. Now, these changes may not take place in our lives, but the interesting thing is that these sort of cooperations, I think, are necessary for Muslims in regards to the broader question of Muslim unity. So I think it's an interesting project. I don't know in terms of the details and how well it will go, but nonetheless, I think these are things that we should view with a level of optimism, because I think this is necessary.
I mean, what I'll do, because I think the murky waters of current affairs for a historian, so I'll take you back to the safer land of history itself. I think one of the very interesting things about what even Sarge mentioned is this idea of the sort of the Pakistanis and the Turks and the voices that they're you know, that they're making the noise when others aren't. But what's interesting, if you look Islamically throughout history, and the Turks and the Indians have always had a very close relationship. I mean, Ertugul is massive in Pakistan, gigantic, it's just enormous. But even historically, the Khilafat movement, the attempt to revive the Khilafah, the women who would give their jewelry away for the sake of Sultan Abdul Hamid, and even, I mean, what I find, and I'd love for you to get your view on this, is the idea that post the Abbasids, or even in the late Abbasid period, when the Arabs sort of fell away and dropped the ball, the Turkic people stepped up to the plate. From the Buyids, the Seljuks, the Ottomans themselves, that the non-Arabs then carried Islam forth for centuries after the Arabs had dropped the ball. And the non-Arabs had this great role to play in the history of Islam. I mean, I'd love just to get some of your thoughts on that generally, but even in the idea coming forward, is the next revival to be an Arab project, a non-Arab project, or?
To be honest with you, I mean, I'm not trying to criticize you here, but I'm a bit reluctant to say the Arabs dropped the ball. I mean, they were,
Okay.
I mean, in the sense that the Abbasids were a Muslim entity that had amalgamated Persianate influences and cultures and Turkic peoples. But the interesting thing is, and where I will extend on your point is I hope that in the Arab world, in particular today's Arab world, they can appreciate that Muslims who are non-Arabs also contributed greatly towards Islam. And in that sense, not only the Ottomans, but Muslims around the world have done something in terms of continue the narrative, the sort of the ideas of Islam, the sort of culture of Islam, the traditions of Islam, and they upheld that for a very long time. And that is something which I think it needs to be appreciated, that this ummah is not simply an ummah restricted to one race, one language, or one group of people. This is the ummah which is has people from around the world who all have something to offer. I've always said this in terms of my position, which is the wisdom is in the collective, which means if there's one form of knowledge which is missing in one part of the Muslim world, you will find it in another part of the Muslim world. In that sense, it's impossible to crush Islam out of the ummah. In that sense, you can crush it out of you can traumatize a particular set of people and try to reduce Islam in a group of people, but you won't be able to reduce it out of everybody, because the ummah is so diverse in that sense. And in that sense, I think there should be an appreciation to see that in other parts of the Muslim world, how they continued the manifestation of Islam. And as you rightly said, during the late Ottoman period in particular, but this goes back to the Abbasid period, that Muslims in the Asian subcontinent in particular had a particular attachment to the center, and definitely during the late period that Muslims in the Asia subcontinent had attachment to Istanbul.
Even though they themselves were under British colonial rule and had
yes, even though, because I mean, for them, and this is where sometimes the historians miss the point, which is that the theological question of the existence of a political center, which you would call the caliphate, was necessary for even in Muslims in India, even if they were not under it. They still felt the necessity of its existence was necessary. this is a unique thing. And they were willing to put their eggs in one basket in the hope that the Ottomans would win, would be victorious in the war, that the British would be the losers in the war, and Muslims in India would find a way of gaining independence and then showing some level of cooperation with the Ottomans in Istanbul. Now, that failed as a project, but what emerged from that as a project is the project of Pakistan, which is this idea that, okay, we need a nation for Muslims. So the imagination remained, which is very unique. And in that sense, I guess the genealogy of Muslims in Pakistan having an attachment to Turkey, it comes from that. Not only that, Muslims in India still have that imagination. It hasn't left Muslims in India either. And I think my personal opinion is I think that Muslims in India and Pakistan need to cooperate with each other by knowing each other's plight better, by being emotionally connected, intellectually connected, spiritually connected, and financially connected before they can be politically connected. And so that attachments are necessary. And you can see that in the case of Turkey and Pakistan, that to some degree, when we start to see Muslim cooperation on that level in regards to states, it gives the Ummah a sense of hope and belief that, you know what, actually maybe it's not all doom and gloom, because we are made to believe that we are secondary and we are useless. And here we start to see some positive moves. And while we may not see the type of change we want to see in our lifetime, the hope is always there. And I think for a Muslim, the hope is necessary.
It's interesting how you mentioned about the British and how they kind of the power dynamic between them and the Ottomans, and particularly with their own domain of India at the time was. I read there was a very interesting point where, in order to appeal to the Indian Muslims who were, as far as they were concerned, very suspicious of, because they thought, well, they've had power for so many centuries, they're likely to overturn us at any point. And this is pre what the British called a mutiny, but we call the first war of freedom and independence. And what happened was, at the time, the British would sell themselves as champions of Ottomans, and particularly by default Muslims overall, when they were taking on the Russians, whilst the Turks were in open kind of battle with them, and I believe there was another state that jumped in as well. But whilst they were fighting them, and then I think there was a farman from the Khalif that was read out of all the domains, but also particularly he would leave a message through the British to them to say that they did help us. And I think this was part of the political scenery at the time, that they were trying to say, look, my enemy's enemy is currently my friend, although this was all realpolitik as well.
Yeah,
but the endorsement there changed some of the landscape for them. It obviously wasn't as powerful as they hoped it would be, because then obviously in 1857 all the different communities, Hindu, Muslim, and anybody else, and India was a myriad of different religions at that time, all joined together under the nominal name of the Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar II. And even though he literally was not the one organizing any of this, it was done in his name. And I think at that time, that the way that the Ottomans' endorsement was played out, the British would have hoped, it showed how they were very conscious of the fact that despite they're all the way, halfway into Europe and very distant Asia, the lands that everyone aspires to go to, the custodians of those holy lands, is the Ottomans. And at that point, their whole dynamic with the Muslims was from that centric point of view, to use them, which I don't think wholesale the Muslim communities completely bought in South Asia particularly.
I think was one of the interesting things is, I mean, in today's day and age, because we don't have that particular imagination of what it means to have that, we find it very hard to make sense of it. But if I can give you an analogy, so like Mecca and Medina in particular are cities that belong to Muslims around the world. If there's something happens to Mecca, Medina, we all have an interest and an agency over it, even if we don't live there, even if we've never been there. In that sense, imagine having a city which is the Caliphate city, which is Istanbul. The Caliphate city as a locus of power operated in the same way, where while Muslims never lived in those cities, they still had a sense of feeling that they had agency over what happened in that city. Now the city might believe, and the Caliph himself might believe, you know what, those people in India are not part of my interest. But the people in India would have said, you know what, irrespective of what's going on, that guy in Istanbul, he needs to do something to try to help us out. So in that sense, you can see that that while these relationships were complicated, and while these relationships were not linear, and while these relationships were continuously moving, considering who was in power, nonetheless, by the time you get to the World War I, you can see that the imaginations of people like Maulana Kalam Azad, which we call Hijazi Maulana, Hijazi Kalam Azad, and the Ali brothers, and Iqbal, and then Maududi and so forth. They had particularly, and the misrepresentation in regards to Indian history is somehow the impression that Gandhi was walking around in a loincloth and got independence from the British. This didn't happen. Give Muslims credit where it's due, that they fought the British tooth and nail because it was the Muslims who were feeling the subjugation of the British because they had political authority and power. And a lot of these Muslims were being arrested and put in prison so that they cannot go to Istanbul. Right? So, yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned Gandhi. There's a particular personality who's very close to my heart around the Ottoman period was the last Shaykh al-Islam, Mustafa Sabri, and he mentioned something once where he said that the state of the Islamic world particularly, it really pained him seeing all the changes that were taking place and how everyone was becoming more, I don't want to keep saying even westernized, because even the Westerners weren't doing some of the things that some of the places like Egypt were doing, particularly where he ended up. But he said that this particular individual can go hungry and the world is up in arms and in outrage. And the last Shaykh al-Islam is hungry. His family is hungry
because he was in exile.
He was completely in exile. There was multiple assassination attempts, even by the new Turkish regime at the time, against him unsuccessfully. But whilst he was enduring all of this, he could have very easily secularized himself and endorsed the Turkish Republic very easily. And he didn't. And he stood by a principle and he continued to write, he continued to serve Islam. And he did this irrespective of the fact that where he was living, without criticizing the state per se, it was the state of Muslims he was criticizing, but in a lamentable way that he is a hero to you, you're following him, you're recognizing him, but I am involuntarily fasting because I have no food. And this is the position I'm stuck in, yet you have no reverence for somebody of ilm who literally had the sway of the entire, at that time, at some stage, the Haramain Sharif, and this particular individual was part of right at the top of power, particularly from religious orthodoxy. But there was just the whole view at that time was completely nationalism. It just completely plagued.
Mustafa Sabri Effendi is exceptionally unique, and I as an Ottoman historian who focuses on
we should do a specific session on him. I'm actually thinking he's so incredible as an individual.
You know, someone like myself who's a historian of the late Ottoman ulama in particular, for me it's a travesty of the highest order that someone like Mustafa Sabri Effendi is absent from the imagination of Muslims around the world today. We venerate scholars of the past in regards to Al-Ghazali and so forth, and yet, you know, someone like Mustafa Sabri Effendi is somebody who is a giant in Islamic history. And for him, like, I mean, the trauma he felt, and Asim had made this point before, which is that when you see the case of Yusuf al-Nabahani, and Yusuf al-Nabahani wasn't the only one who felt this, the Ottomans never conceived the idea that their state was going to collapse. They just never believed it. In fact, they institutionalized it in their constitution that the Ottoman Sultanate is the Sultanate of the Caliphate. And the reason why they did that is because they believe it will be here to the end of time, and no other Muslim entity should attempt to challenge the Ottomans for the seat of the Caliphate. So imagine your Mustafa Sabri Effendi, who's seen, like, you know, who's a librarian to Abdul Hamid II, who sees the constitutional revolution, and then sees this
who had a part to play in the constitutional revolution. We have to be honest as well, right?
Yeah, he did
in
have
that
a role to play in the constitutional revolution. It's true, and you see the complexities of internal Muslim contestations, and yet he sees this all collapse around him. And imagine the type of world that Mustafa Sabri Effendi is involved in. So he's close to the Sultan, he's a librarian. He's involved in Sufi tariqats. He's involved in terms of his interaction with a Sufi world. He's involved in the movement by living in Romania, Greece, Istanbul, Tokat, Lebanon, Jeddah, Cairo. His worldview is like that. It's huge. And so when he's writing monumental works, his work is a reflection of the worldview he belonged to, which is extraordinary. And then to become reduced to a nation state where you're stuck in one area, I mean, it must have been exceptionally traumatizing for someone like him. And you can see that in his work, the trauma is clear. Nonetheless, he was a very principled man from what I understand in terms of what I've read about him. He stuck by his principles, he stuck by his belief in his Aqidah, and he believed that fundamentally the Muslim Aqidah needs protecting. And so he went to Fanel to say, okay, I've seen the Khilafah collapse in front of my eyes, but we cannot afford the Aqidah of the Ummah to be lost. The Aqidah of Islam needs to be safeguarded, and so I'm going to write a monumental piece of work making that case. And I think that's necessary, that fundamentally he understood that while the Khilafah for him was a fard, and that's what he said in his work, nonetheless, even though he didn't have one, he believed that the Aqidah of Islam was something which was necessary and that shouldn't be lost. And for me right now, that's a very interesting question. When I ask people today, what is your Aqidah? And they can't answer it. And so I think that's a standard that should be taught to every Muslim in terms of their Aqidah, so that their foundations are tight.
I just want to, because I think it's Ustad Yahya Nurgat. I mean, we've had him on before. He did a show for us on the history of the Hajj, and we all, one thing we all have in common, apart from Saj, with Sheikh Nurgat, is he's also a Liverpool fan. So marhaba to him as well. I think it's like a recurring theme. I remember my brother said it. He goes, I've struggled to find a historian who's not a Liverpool fan, a Muslim historian. It's like any Muslims who've got some interest in Islamic history would just happen to be Liverpool fans. And the Ottomans have a link to Liverpool with Abdullah Quilliam rahmatullah alayhi as the Shaykhul Islam of the British Isles, as representative of Sultan Abdul Hamid. I always make this argument. It's like I think there's an argument for mustahab to be a Liverpool fan. If Allah knows best. But what I think in terms
just to iterate, the original Abdullah Quilliam, not another organisation.
Not the Quilliam Foundation, by the way. Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam rahmatullah alayhi was a completely different person to them. But this point of Aqidah, and I think we have to be slightly conscious of the time and look to start finishing soon as well. But this point you made about Aqidah, and there has been, since the collapse of the Khilafah, the trauma. You spoke about the trauma.
Yeah.
And Muslims trying to figure out their identity and the place in the world that they live in as Ibadullah, as creation of Allah Ta'ala first and foremost, and then as His representatives upon the earth, with the absence of the great system that was the Khilafah. And then in their responses in the current age, you spoke when you came to High Wycombe about the idea of decolonizing history, that we need to stop seeing history through the lens of the European. We have to see history through the lens of the Quran and the Sunnah, and through the way that Allah Ta'ala wants us to see history, right? But at the same time, what we're seeing in Western circles, in Muslim discourse, and is this idea that there's, like the idea of postmodernism, critical race theory, that they've co-opted somebody else's narrative in terms of trying to deal with the trauma that we are facing as Muslims. And the Islamic conversation, we're not talking in the language of Islam a lot of the time. We speak, Imam Zayd Shakir came on recently and spoke about the exact same thing. That in our political discourse, again, we've co-opted the language of Marx, Foucault, and all of these people, whereas our own thinkers, you mentioned Mustafa Sabri. If you want a post-colonial thinker, Mustafa Sabri is your guy, but they've been abandoned, and we've taken on other people. As we come to the idea of like what we should do to learn history, and as Muslims, and the importance you mentioned of Aqidah, right? How important is it for Muslims now to engage in these fields whilst other people have now made their own way in and co-opted the discourse on our behalf, and we're just sort of left standing?
It's imperative. As far as I'm concerned, someone like Mustafa Sabri Effendi, when you look at the works that he wrote, maybe you won't call it decolonial because he's not using the buzzwords of the decolonialists of today. But if you actually understand what he's writing from the Islamic framework, it's an anti-colonial tract. It's a work that's entrenched in the Aqidah of Islam, the tradition of Islam, and Islam as an alternative worldview for humanity, not just for people and for Muslims and the people at the time. It's a work which is timeless, and it's a work that the ulama always do, which is, apart from maybe fatwa culture, by and large, the ulama, when they write in the ummatic paradigm, they write for the Muslims until the end of time. That's how you write it. And it's supposed to be very relatable for Muslims in their vicinity and outside of their vicinity. In that sense, if we cannot draw from the culture of Islam, which is very diverse, which is very eclectic and very rich, then something's missing here. And what I've noticed is that the difference between, let's just say, Western pedagogy and Islamic pedagogy. In Western pedagogy, by and large, books are written to be read and understood. But in Islamic pedagogy, books are written to study. And they're studied with the manifestation of the scholar teaching you. And that person is a manifestation of the ideas of Islam themselves. So they're not only teaching the works of the book, they're teaching a particular mannerism and behavior by being embodied, by being in front of you. This is why this interaction is necessary. When I was speaking to my mum quite recently in England, and my mum was telling me, Yaqoob, look, how do we fix some of the problems that exist in regards to the interactions between male and females? And I said, fundamentally, mum, I think a lot of women are correct in their criticism of men, because a lot of men lack tawakkul. The consequence is the absence of tawakkul, the fear of Allah Ta'ala. The fear of Allah Ta'ala for the average human being, a Muslim, is necessary. The fact that human beings no longer have tawakkul when they're doing a particular activity is for me scary. It means that they haven't internalized something which is part of the essence of their being, which is their soul. Their soul is a reflection of being a person of tawakkul, of being a person of tawheed, of being a person who adheres to what Allah Ta'ala requires for them. And so the fact that this is missing in people, I think, is a huge loss in regards to who we are as Muslims. So the Islamic culture is not simply one which is restricted to matters to do with religious rituals and so forth. It's one which is definitely rational. I've said this to my students all the time, which is that when you do your shahada is from ashhadu. The word ashhadu is the testimony of a person of knowing. You know what you're testifying to. That means you're a person who recognizes. And you know, I said this to you guys, to Asim before when I was teaching some of the guys, which is insan. The word insan comes from the idea of the one who forgets. We are forgetful. And so when Allah Ta'ala, via Jibreel alayhi salam, reveals the verses to Rasul Salam in the cave, it's intriguing because he's saying to Rasul Salam, he's educated him and reminding him that I created you from what? And I taught you how to use the pen. Don't forget. Ya insan, have you forgotten that me, Allah, I'm the one who created you, and I'm the one who taught you what you know, and don't become arrogant and become, and so forth. And that's intriguing for me because what it indicates is the Quran as a book has to be manifest in the lives of Muslims, and the Aqidah of Islam has to be the foundations from which Muslims learn everything that they do. And if that's missing in their lives, then the way that they're going to learn information is just going to be pure information. It's not going to be learning of knowledge for the view of hikmah, wisdom. And very rarely can we say today that people are people of wisdom. And that's what Islam expects. We're looking for ulama who are people of wisdom. And so I can't say this strong enough to the young kids or whoever's listening out there, that go back to your foundations. If your foundations are weak, your house is going to be shoddy. I get the fact that you want to read Foucault and Derrida and all of these things. I read them. But it doesn't mean that I turn away from the works and the words of my Lord, which is the Quran. And I focus on that. I focus on my ibadat. I focus on my character building. I focus on being pious, generous, friendly, helpful, and so forth. And I focus on my aqidah as the foundations of who I am, because that's what it means to be a human being in that sense.
There's a couple of really good things you mentioned there, especially about the certainty. That just reminds me something. Maula Ali once said that if all the veils were removed from my eyes, it wouldn't increase my certainty in Allah. And that to have even had that kind of focus on that takes something that our community just doesn't have. We have a huge debate culture online at the moment that people learn just so that they can win an argument with someone else.
Well, can I just add to that? Sorry to interrupt you. So in the Shahada, we say La ilaha. The first word is no. No is a certain term. It's a certain word. You say something with certainty. And what I'm saying is that when the basis of your foundation is based on certainty, then you have a sense of confidence in terms of who you are. But if you ignore the foundations of your existence, if you have uncertainty in the fundamental question of who you are, then it leads to uncertainty in every single other thing you do in your life. And I was talking to kids who watch The Mandalorian, because one of the interesting things about The Mandalorian is the vocalization in the show when they say, this is the way, right? And it's intriguing because the vocalization of your shahada, la ilaha illallah, is Allah Ta'ala is reminded us in our culture, and Rasul Sallam has done this via his tradition, which is to vocalize it so that you remember, so that you don't forget.
Make dhikr.
The vocalization of these ideas with certainty is so important because you don't forget, because insan forgets. So you say Alhamdulillah, you say Subhanallah, you say Assalamu alaikum. The verbalization, Star Wars does this. May the force be with you. It's intriguing that they recognize this idea of the vocalization. And Islam does that. It's part of our tradition. It's part of our culture. And the Shahada must be understood, and it must be continuously vocalized and internalized so that their Aqidah is tight like that, and they understand it with certainty, so that they don't have uncertainty in other matters in life. And so when I meet young people on this social media, train wreck that we're seeing right now, it's because they lack certainty on the fundamental question, which is La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. It's very simple to me.
So I was just going to mention, you mentioned books before as well, and it's important to kind of review them as well. What sort of books would you recommend for anybody who's interested in Ottoman history, and any sort of aspects, specific specialisms that we've discussed today as well, especially in terms of governance, how the ulama system was? What books would you personally recommend that you found helpful?
To be honest with you, I mean, I've just been reading everything and anything, and one of the things that I've learned.
I mean, what we could is, Doc, I could state, because obviously I'm in touch with you, we could just get you to type up, I know off the top, if you could recommend a few, but at the same time, maybe we could type up a document and then...
I've always said this about writing up documents, but this is going to sound like a cop-out, but I believe that the teacher is the institution. And so we should be seeking for people who are people of wisdom and knowledge, who can teach us in a way that who are the institutions, and we need to seek out and create institutions in this sense. We need to create thinkers. And so one of the reasons why I teach Ottoman history in the way that I teach it is that often my students are asking me, can you just give me a book that I can read? And I say, no, because the problem is that you don't know where the problem areas are in the scholarship. You don't know where the contestations are in the scholarship. You don't know what debates we're having in the scholarship. How about we debate this book together? How about you read it and we can talk about this? Because I'm in the field and I do this all the time. And I think that's part of the Islamic pedagogy, and that should manifest in every way that we do learning. And we shouldn't take that out of Ottoman studies. But no doubt, I can give you a list of books that you can read. I mean, I think people like Inalcik were very good. I think in terms of late Ottoman history, there's some very good academics and thinkers right now who are writing fantastic works that I can give you names of and so forth. But what I want to see fundamentally, and I hope I'm not like derailing the question, I want to see you guys and young people, really investing in Islamic history as part of the curricula. Let's get this, let's get this going, because if we have an absence in our understanding of such a long period of history, not just Ottoman history, but like the transatlantic slave trade is part of Islamic history. A lot of the victims were Muslim. The colonization of the Asian subcontinent, this is a Muslim question. The fall of the Andalusians, Muslims in Spain, this is a Muslim question. The plight of Muslims in China, this is a Muslim question. So the more we are in touch with how human beings worked and operated and so forth, the better understanding we'll have in terms of who we are right now. And so let's get this on our curriculums.
Alhamdulillah. I mean, just to sort of, obviously we have our series that we've done together, which is more aimed at young teenagers, but I think it will be very beneficial for people, which Dr. Yaqoob taught, and I would like to say I was a minor teaching assistant with him, alhamdulillah, and that was an incredible experience. That will be coming out on the Karima YouTube channel very soon, inshallah ta'ala. Dr. Yaqoob has lectures online that he's done also. I mean, there's some courses you're doing at the moment. I mean, where would people go to find you? Do you have a Facebook page or something that they can find more details? Or you can tell us now.
So I'm starting a course, funnily enough, tomorrow on late Ottoman history. It's a paid course. The reason why that was done is to sort of like facilitate the nominal fees for the people that are organizing it. And I did one on Ottoman history initially, and now I'm doing one on late Ottoman history, which will be on Wednesdays and Saturdays for 8 weeks. And the idea is to interact with Muslims and give them an opportunity to have access to me full on, so that we can help them. By and large, my main interest is just to teach Muslims as much as I can and to motivate them as much as possible. Asim made a very important point, and both of you have, which is the lack of motivation that exists in Muslims right now. The Sunnah of Rasul Sallam is that a Muslim must always be optimistic, because in the end of the day, if life is tough, alhamdulillah, this is a test from Allah Ta'ala. If life is great, alhamdulillah, this is a gift from Allah Ta'ala. In the end of the day, we're working to get to the akhirah. So we must be hopeful, even if I always say to people, and I want to stress this to everyone listening today, the outcome is not as important as the process. The process is the most important thing. So from the story of the Isra and Miraj, when Rasulullah is going to meet Allah Ta'ala, he meets prophets on the way. He sees some prophets with thousands of followers, some prophets with hundreds, and then some prophets with zero, no followers. And my students always ask, what's the deal with the 0 followers? They were the people that were putting dents in society, so that when the next prophet came, people ran with it. And if we are the people right now who are putting dents in society, inshallah, people will run with it. Let's look at the case of Mustafa Sabri Effendi. He saw, the Ottomans collapse in front of his eyes, but he left work behind that so that we can read and he left a dent in society. And let's continue being optimistic in that sense. Sometimes it can be very demotivated looking around the world and seeing the plight of the ummah. But just like the case of Musa alayhi salam, and Allah Ta'ala reminded him that Musa, I will take care of the ummah after you. I don't think that, there were, because Musa didn't want to go. Yeah, Musa, listen, don't worry about it. Your job is done here. So let's not be that arrogant in assuming that we're going to save Islam. It's the deen of Allah Ta'ala. He will protect Islam. He'll protect his ummah. But let's keep doing the work. And let's try to put in the effort to create a ummah which are competent and knowledgeable and appear to the right path. So this is what I fundamentally believe. So I know I sidetracked off your question a little bit. My apologies for that.
No, it's...
Well, alhamdulillah, I'm just again, we got another question. Somebody in Istanbul is asking, do you run any courses in Istanbul? Shall we ask them to sign up for the university, or how would they, is there anything happening on the ground that they can possibly sign up for?
So the guys in Istanbul who know me in Istanbul know that I generally used to do a lot of free courses in Istanbul, no problem about that. But with the current pandemic and so forth, that's just become impossible. Once the pandemic, inshallah, is over, and if I'm still alive, then I'm willing to give that a go again and try to encourage as many people as possible. But in fairness to the person who's asked the question from Istanbul, they know that there are plenty of better academics, thinkers, Muslims, and Ottoman historians in Istanbul than me. And they have better resources than finding myself. What I've tried to do, and it's very unfortunate that I've become one of the very few Ottoman historians for Muslims in the Western world. I mean, the fact that I'm the only one who's continuously been, brought to the table. I mean, alhamdulillah.
You speak English. This is one of the biggest blessings.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And I wish it wasn't just me. I wish, wallahi, I mean this with the bottom of my heart, which is I don't want people to be like me. I want people to be better than me, because I want this ummah to be, to the best that it can be. And I want to encourage, and I'm sure that I'll find students who will be better than me. And the way that they will, I mean, like just the way you guys are speaking right now, I mean, you're not even Ottoman historians, and the way that you've gone into the subject here is fascinating for me to see that you have an innate interest in the learning of Islamic history. Now, imagine if you had thinkers, people, and institutions that would support you. So in some ways, we need to find a way of taking scholars who have got university qualifications and finding some ways where they can go into the communities and give the community the knowledge base so that they can run with that. And we need to find, the internet is one way of decentralized education, but another way is to find ways of investing in our communities. We need to be creative now. We need to find a different way of doing this.
I mean, that's a very beautiful point you make, and I do realize that I do want to bring this to a close. But one thing I think that final point to sort of touch on, and you sort of touched on it already, is one of the problems we have as Muslim communities in the West through the heavily materialistic lens that the world is seen through now, is this fascination with my putter is going to be a doctor, my son's going to be an engineer, and this push, and for sometimes for good financial reasoning as well, that people want their kids to have financial stability in the topsy-turvy capitalistic world that we live in. And so the children are being incentivized and pushed into certain directions. They have all these quotas for girls to study STEM subjects. There's an idea to incentivize people to become scientists and go into technical fields, but at the same time, the abandonment of the Islamic sciences, the abandonment of history, the abandonment of philosophy, the abandonment of all these what they call the soft sciences is a massive problem that we have with our young people, sort of just running away from them, and other people with dodgy, people of corrupt aqidah, people of deviated beliefs are picking up that mantle and disseminating their version of that narrative, like we mentioned before. I mean, just as an institutional message, or even to the young people themselves who are precariously standing and thinking, should I go this way, should I go that way? Or they have an idea that they want to study Ottoman history, but they're scared that maybe I won't have the financial stability later, my parents won't be happy. I mean, I studied economics, and that was hard enough for my parents to get over, but they did, because economics is hard science enough. But nevertheless, what message would you give as a closing sort of?
I think you're right. I think the pressure is enormous. I mean, we live in a particular world right now, which is like, look, I don't blame Muslims for going into the STEM subjects. I mean, we need doctors. I mean, like, my mum feels comfortable that her doctor is a female Muslim. So we need female Muslim doctors, no doubt about that. We need male Muslim doctors. We need people who are in the fields of economics, politics, and so forth. But Saying all of that, we need people who are thinkers in our community, who are bastions of thought and civilization in our society, people who we can turn to, who are upright, who give us hikmah, who give us knowledge, who give us a sense of ease and coolness when we're going through difficulties in our life. These people are equally valuable and necessary. And any civilization that doesn't have a group of people that does that for them is a society which is at loss. The Rasul Sallam had his Sahaba, and the Sahaba are very important in that context. Throughout Islamic history, we talk about the ulama. Why are the ulama important? Because these were people of knowledge and wisdom who somehow made Islam relatable for them. Islam is your lifeblood in that sense, you know. Islam is what you live for. And in that sense, you can't cheapen Islam and cheapen the people of Islam. If you are a person who wants to study Islam, then we as a Muslim community need to support those people. If you are a person who's unable to do that, that's fine. Study your STEM subjects, but part-time, find people who can help you study Islam on the side, at home. Like what we're doing right now in terms of the conversation, the onus is on people like myself, who are people in particular positions of authority and so forth, to find means and ways for you so that you can learn it. So if you want to learn it, if you show the desire that you want it, then we will try to find a way of facilitating that. Now, you know, we need to get creative as a community. The reason why you learn Islam is not to have a certificate to find a job. The reason why you have Islam is so that you become a quality thinker and somebody who pleases Allah Ta'ala, but also makes his community a better community. You know what I mean? That's necessary. And the fact that these young people these days are missing that, and then they go into alternative spaces. Those alternative spaces are social media and so forth. And the information on social media is such a reduction. It's such a reduction to the sort of complex, nuanced knowledge that a human being can give you. And that's, I find, you know, the problem I have with social media in particular, it's dehumanizing. Yeah. It dehumanizes knowledge and people from the knowledge. You just see information and then you're just mad all the time. You're just yelling and screaming at each other. You know, whereas when you sit down with a person who's a teacher like myself, I put my arm around you, I say, how you doing today? What happened to you? Are you okay?
Not at the moment though, because of social distancing.
Because of social distancing. Do you know what I mean? And there's a humaneness. You get to see that I care. You get to see that I'm interested in you. And so when I'm teaching you Islam, I'm not just teaching you information. I want to see embodied in you. And that social media is not giving. Now, I know there's a lot of trust that has been broken by many scholars from around the world who have done particular things that upset Muslims. I understand that. That's a given that's going to happen throughout history. But there are also many good Muslims in our communities that we can turn to. And so we need to find those people, and we need to raise those people, and we need to encourage those people. And if you see talent in our communities, if you see young talent, support it. If they don't want to be scholars or ulama, they want to be doctors, that's fine, but still give them the education. It's not an either or here. It can all be done, you know.
Alhamdulillah. I just, there's a beautiful statement sort of Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi when he first entered the Nizamiyya to study, or when he entered the madrasa to study for the first time, and he was because he was a poor, he lived in a state of poverty as a child, and so he was entered into the madrasa just as a form of, you know, at least he'll have something to eat. And there's a famous statement that he says, طَلَبْتُ الْعِلْمِ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ فَأَبَى الْعِلْمُ إِلَّا إِن يَكُونَ لِلَّهِ, that I sought knowledge for other than Allah, but knowledge refuses to be for anyone other than Allah Ta'ala.
You know, I learned this from a Hoja of mine when I was young. He said, Yaqoob, that Allah Ta'ala will never put obstacles in the way of the person who wants to do ibadah. For the objective of the abd is to worship Allah Ta'ala. Why would he stop you from doing that? So for any of you who wants to study ilm, and ilm is ibadah, then Allah Ta'ala will find ways of making it easy for you. Now, you might be tested by Allah, but the test from Allah Ta'ala comes to strengthen your character, just the way that he tested his anbiya. There's no shame in that. I mean, I tell my students that, you know, when you ask Allah Ta'ala for sabr, be careful what you're asking for, because sabr is not given to you like a plate on a dish, you know, a dish on a plate. Sabr, you're going to be put through situations where you learn sabr, because that's something that you have to internalize. For those of us who are students of knowledge and so forth, you know, and we've been through a lot of difficulties, and I see that in the work of the ulama that I've read in the past. And in some ways, as I read that, when I read the stories of the Anbiya and Rasul Sallam, you see this in the case of the Battle of Badr, where the Muslims are victorious in the Battle of Badr, and yet Rasul Sallam comes home with his daughter who has just died. Allah Ta'ala had tested his messenger in this way, in the most victorious moment for the Muslims in that sense. Why is Allah Ta'ala doing that? Because he's strengthening the character of Rasul Sallam and shaping him into a particular human being. In that sense, it's necessary then to be steadfast and to be strong. And when you're going through difficulties, make sure that there are Muslims around you who will support you, take care of you emotionally, physically, and financially, so that you can continue this work for the community. You're not doing this as an individual. Always remember that when you're studying Islam, it's not for you, it's for the collective. You're part of a collective. When Allah Ta'ala revealed the Quran to Muslims, it wasn't so that you read it as an individual, only as a book. He gave that book for the ummah as a whole. He's talking to the ummah as a collective. Understand how the Quran operates, and we need to be connected as people, right? So remember that. This is why when I do like Ulumuddin, I feel a huge sense of pressure on my shoulders and responsibility that I didn't expect when I was young, which is that the one, I have to uphold particular principles in the eyes of Allah, which makes me very scared. And I feel very nervous, and I have this huge imposter syndrome regarding my relationship with my Lord. And the second thing is because I know that there are many young Muslims who want to know information, and I have to be available for them. And we should be.
Alhamdulillah. I mean, I just want to, I hope this is not the last time we have you on, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah.
I pray.
Can I just say,
Enjoy.
first, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. If I've said anything out of line or anything of that nature, I sincerely do apologize. And I know that sometimes I have a habit of ranting and so forth, but it's just because I genuinely care. But I really do appreciate that you've given me the opportunity, because I'm a nobody in many ways. There are better thinkers and scholars and people out there, but you still continuously give me the izzah in hearing my opinions, wanting to listen to me, and allowing me to express my thoughts and emotions. And I'm an emotional person, and sometimes I go off track sometimes. But I'm really appreciative that you give me that platform and you allow me to speak. And I hope that I can, in a small way, maybe just influence some of you of trying to do the right thing.
Well,
I have to say, you have a passion for the haqq, and the thing that you say, you're not saying things out of turn or having a rant. You're somebody who speaks with knowledge, and the frustrations, a Muslim's frustration is haqq, because they will have frustrations for the right thing and they're guided the right way. Yeah. And alhamdulillah, I know personally you've definitely imparted a hell of a lot of knowledge to me, especially around contemporary issues, when it was around the Hagia Sophia time, particularly when you literally vocalized every single thing I was feeling at the time around that issue. And particularly with your sort of view on history, you are very objective, but you have a lens from a Muslim point of view, which is exactly what our community is missing when reading our own history. And that's something that's massively missing in a lot of our ulama. For example, they will talk about a particular topic they're not actually proficient in, whereas you speak with knowledge on those topics. And I know a lot of people will appreciate that, but we certainly appreciate you coming on today. And
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and we hope that soon, inshallah, we will have the honor of hosting you in person again in High Wycombe when you come down to the UK, inshallah. And I'm really looking forward to. I think this idea of doing a standalone Mustafa Sabri program, I think there's some legwork in that, and I think I'm going to see if I can push that one through, inshallah ta'ala.
Yeah, inshallah. like I said, I mean, for me, I've learned to be available to the Muslim community. The only time I say no is because I just don't have the time.
How would people contact you should we, if people want to contact you, shall we let them contact us and we can facilitate connection potentially, or do you have like a social media, anything that people...
I'm off social media now because I just found it too toxic. And you know what it was? Well, one of the strange things I found was that social media doesn't allow you to contemplate and think. You always have to have an opinion on the spot, And one of the things that I've noticed in life is that serious issues require serious contemplation. It doesn't require a video coming out on YouTube every week to listen to the demands of the mob in that sense. So I came off social media. In a strange way, people find it weird. I've gone to the archaic form of emails. So just send me an email, and I'm a bit slow in responding to people's emails because I'm just trying to slow my life down, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic. But just feel free to give people my email, and I will try to respond as quickly as I can. If I do not respond to your email, my apologies, just send me another one. My memory is getting, it's becoming like a sieve, it's just I'm forgetting things all the time. And just on the last point you made about the people of knowledge, one of the things that I say to my students, if you don't know something, there's no shame in saying you don't know. Okay, and if I've said anything out of turn here and out of knowledge, I'm more than happy to renegotiate that and say that was wrong. And maybe, I lacked the information. There's only so much information a person has. And I sometimes am frustrated when I see the celebrity scholars on the social media circuit talking about Islamic history and Ottoman history in particular, and they know nothing about the subject area. I don't talk about fiqh. I don't talk about ulum. I don't talk about the Quran in the way that it should be spoken about. And I say, if you're not an Ottoman historian, just speak to us. We're more than happy to help you. We're not your enemy. We're on the same side. You don't need to do this. You don't need to fudge something and it becomes a farce, And then the Muslims start believing this, and then the non-Muslims are critiquing us for being knuckleheads. This is not necessary, So we're on the same team. Come and speak to us. We're trying to raise the ummah and raise the intelligence and the knowledge of the ummah. So, find us.
No, alhamdulillah. So if people do want to get in touch with Dr. Yaqoob, if you reach out to us at the Karima Foundation on the website, then we will inshallah facilitate connection, especially if people run any sort of community organizations or schools or things, and they want to get Dr. Yaqoob to sort of come do some programs for them. Alhamdulillah, he will try. I guess I'm nervous that this might leave you inundated with requests, but as much as his time will facilitate, I know that he will give time, because he has always given time to me, especially in my studies of I'm studying economic history, and Dr. Yaqoob has been immensely beneficial for me. There's a YouTube channel. What's the YouTube channel? The one that you host different scholars on? Is it Islamic Circles? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's Islamic Circles. So
if you go on sorry, go on.
Yeah, in the next couple of weeks, this month, I'll be talking to 4 scholars in particular. I'll be talking to Guy Burak about the formation of Hanafi law. I'll be talking to Sami Ayub about the Majalla. I'll be talking to an academic on the Ilahiyat, and I'll be talking to Osama Maqdisi on sectarianism in the Ottoman period.
So if people go to the Islamic Circles YouTube channel, there's a brother, I don't know, I think he's a brother from London, who sort of organizes these academic conversations. I'll be honest, it's a bit high level, so you have to be ready for that. You have to raise your game slightly to engage there. But I know Dr. Yaqoob has hosted some very, very good scholars there. Sami Ayub I met as well. These are incredible scholars on some of the very high level discussions that are taking place in the Islamic world at the moment. So do check that out. Ibrahim Ali, I know that's a dear friend of mine. He's asking if you'd be interested in working on an Ottoman steampunk manga. I'll contact you privately on that one, inshallah. But
I'm all up for the manga. I'm all up for the manga. We need an Ottoman version of the We need an Ottoman version of the Falcon Heights.
They were not expecting that. That would be good.
And another way we bonded, me and Dr. Yaqoob, was his love of anime and manga, and I also had an appreciation of that. So, but alhamdulillah, jazakallah so much, Dr. Yaqoob. We pray that that Allah Ta'ala places immense blessings in your life. We pray that Allah Ta'ala places immense blessings in your knowledge. We pray that Allah Ta'ala blesses you and your family and continues to allow you to serve His deen, and to be a conduit for actions that will be a coolness to the eyes of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. To all the viewers, to Dr. Yaqoob, and from me and Saj, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.